I have seen 3 pictures of the man. The first, a childhood photograph, you might call it, shows him at about the age of 10, a small boy surrounded by a great many women, his sisters and cousins, no doubt. He stands in brightly checked trousers by the edge of a garden pond. His head is tilted at an angle, 30 degrees to the left, and his teeth are bared in an ugly smirk. Ugly? You may well question the word, for insensitive people, that is to say, those indifferent to matters of beauty and ugliness, would mechanically comment with a bland, vacuous expression. What an adorable little boy! It is quite true that what commonly passes for adorable is sufficiently present in this child's face to give some modicum of meaning to the compliment. But I think that anyone who has ever been subjected to even the slightest exposure to what makes for beauty would most likely toss the photograph aside with the gesture employed in brushing away a caterpillar and mutter in profound revulsion. What a dreadful child! Indeed, the more carefully you examine the child's smiling face, the more you feel an indescribable, unspeakable horror creeping over you. You see that it is actually not a smiling face at all. The boy does not have the faintest suggestion of a smile. Look at his tightly clenched fists if you want proof. No human being can smile with his fists doubled like that. It is a monkey. A grinning monkey face. The smile is nothing more than a puckering of ugly wrinkles. The photograph captures an expression so freakish, and at the same time so unclean and even nauseating, that your impulse is to say, "What a wizened, hideous little boy!" I have never seen a child with such an unaccountable expression. The face in the second snapshot is startlingly unlike the first. He is a student in this picture, although it is not clear whether it dates from high school or college days. At any rate, he is now extraordinarily handsome. But here again, the face fails inexplicably to give the impression of belonging to a living human being. He wears a student's uniform, and a white handkerchief peeps from his breast pocket. He sits in a wicker chair with his legs crossed. Again, he is smiling, this time not the wizened monkey's grin, but a rather adroit little smile. And yet, somehow, it is not the smile of a human being. It utterly lacks substance, all of what we might call the heaviness of blood, or perhaps the solidity of human life. It does not even have a bird's weight. It is merely a blank sheet of paper, light as a feather, and it is smiling. The picture produces, in short, a sensation of complete artificiality. Pretense, insincerity, fatuousness, none of these words quite covers it. And of course, you couldn't dismiss it simply as dandyism. In fact, if you look carefully, you will begin to feel that there is something strangely unpleasant about this handsome young man. I have never seen a young man whose good looks were so baffling. The remaining photograph is the most monstrous of all. It is quite impossible, in this one, even to guess the age, though the hair seems to be streaked somewhat with gray. It was taken in a corner of an extraordinarily dirty room. You can plainly see in the picture how the wall is crumbling in 3 places. His small hands are held in front of him. This time, he is not smiling. There is no expression whatsoever. The picture has a genuinely chilling, foreboding quality, as if it caught him in the act of dying as he sat before the camera, his hands held over a heater. That is not the only shocking thing about it. The head is shown quite large, and you can examine the features in detail. The forehead is average, the wrinkles on the forehead average, the eyebrows also average, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the chin. The face is not merely devoid of expression, it fails even to leave a memory. I have only to shut my eyes after looking at it to forget the face. I can remember the wall of the room, the little heater, but all impression of the face of the principal figure in the room is blotted out. I am unable to recall a single thing about it. This face could never be made the subject of a painting, not even of a cartoon. I open my eyes. There is not even the pleasure of recollecting, of course, that's the kind of face it was. To state the matter in the most extreme terms, when I open my eyes and look at the photograph a second time, I still cannot remember it. Besides, it rubs me the wrong way and makes me feel so uncomfortable that, in the end, I want to avert my eyes. I think that even a death mask would hold more of an expression, leave more of a memory. That effigy suggests nothing so much as a human body to which a horse's head has been attached. Something ineffable makes the beholder shudder in distaste. I have never seen such an inscrutable face on a man. As a child, the most painful part of the day was unquestionably mealtime, especially in my own home. At my house in the country, the whole family, about 10 in number, ate together, lined up in 2 facing rows at the table. Being the youngest child, I naturally sat at the end. The dining room was dark, and the sight of the 10 or more members of the household eating their lunch, or whatever the meal was, in gloomy silence, was enough to send chills through me. Besides, this was an old-fashioned country household where the food was more or less prescribed, and it was useless even to hope for unusual or extravagant dishes. I dreaded mealtime more each day. I would sit there at the end of the table in the dimly lit room and, trembling all over as with the cold, I would lift a few morsels of food to my mouth and push them in. Why must human beings eat 3 meals every single day? What extraordinarily solemn faces they all make as they eat! It seems to be some kind of ritual. 3 times every day at the regulated hour, the family gathers in this gloomy room. The places are all laid out in the proper order and, regardless of whether we're hungry or not, we munch our food in silence, with lowered eyes. Who knows? It may be an act of prayer to propitiate whatever spirits may be lurking around the house. At times I went so far as to think in such terms. Eat or die, the saying goes, but to my ears it sounded like just one more unpleasant threat. Nevertheless, this superstition, I could only think of it as such, always aroused doubt and fear in me. Nothing was so hard for me to understand, so baffling, and at the same time so filled with menacing overtones as the commonplace remark. Human beings work to earn their bread, for if they don't eat, they die. In other words, you might say that I still have no understanding of what makes human beings tick. My apprehension on discovering that my concept of happiness seemed to be completely at variance with that of everyone else was so great as to make me toss sleeplessly and groan night after night in my bed. It drove me indeed to the brink of lunacy. I wonder if I have actually been happy. People have told me, more times than I can remember, ever since I was a small boy, how lucky I was, but I have always felt as if I were suffering in hell. It has seemed to me, in fact, that those who called me lucky were incomparably more fortunate than I. I have sometimes thought that I have been burdened with a pack of 10 misfortunes, any one of which, if borne by my neighbor, would be enough to make a murderer of him. I simply don't understand. I have not the remotest clue what the nature or extent of my neighbor's woes can be. Practical troubles, griefs that can be assuaged if only there is enough to eat. These may be the most intense of all burning hells, horrible enough to blast to smithereens my 10 misfortunes. But that is precisely what I don't understand. If my neighbors manage to survive without killing themselves, without going mad, maintaining an interest in political parties, not yielding to despair, resolutely pursuing the fight for existence, can their griefs really be genuine? Am I wrong in thinking that these people have become such complete egoists, and are so convinced of the normality of their way of life that they have never once doubted themselves? If that is the case, their sufferings should be easy to bear. They are the common lot of human beings and perhaps the best one can hope for. I don't know /. If you've slept soundly at night, the morning is exhilarating, I suppose? What kind of dreams do they have? What do they think about when they walk along the street? Money? Hardly. It couldn't only be that. I seem to have heard the theory advanced that human beings live in order to eat, but I've never heard anyone say that they lived in order to make money. No. And yet, in some instances. No, I don't even know that. The more I think of it, the less I understand. All I feel are the assaults of apprehension and terror at the thought that I am the only one who is entirely unlike the rest. It is almost impossible for me to converse with other people. What should I talk about? How should I say it? I don't know. This was how I happened to invent my clowning. It was the last quest for love I was to direct at human beings. Although I had a mortal dread of human beings, I seemed quite unable to renounce their society. I managed to maintain on the surface a smile which never deserted my lips. This was the accommodation I offered to others, a most precarious achievement performed by me only at the cost of excruciating efforts within. As a child, I had absolutely no notion of what others, even members of my own family, might be suffering or what they were thinking. I was aware only of my own unspeakable fears and embarrassments. Before anyone realized it, I had become an accomplished clown, a child who never spoke a single truthful word. I have noticed that in photographs of me taken about that time together with my family, the others all have serious faces. Only mine is invariably contorted into a peculiar smile. This was one more variety of my childish, pathetic antics. Again, I never once answered back anything said to me by my family. The least word of reproof struck me with the force of a thunderbolt, and drove me almost out of my head. Answer back? Far from it. I felt convinced that their reprimands were without doubt voices of human truth speaking to me from eternities past. I was obsessed with the idea that since I lacked the strength to act in accordance with this truth, I might already have been disqualified from living among human beings. This belief made me incapable of arguments or self-justification. Whenever anyone criticized me, I felt certain that I had been living under the most dreadful misapprehension. I always accepted the attack in silence, though inwardly so terrified as almost to be out of my mind. It is true, I suppose, that nobody finds it exactly pleasant to be criticized or shouted at, but I see in the face of the human being raging at me a wild animal in its true colors, one more horrible than any lion, crocodile, or dragon. People normally seem to be hiding this true nature, but an occasion will arise, as when an ox sedately ensconced in a grassy meadow suddenly lashes out with its tail to kill the horsefly on its flank, when anger makes them reveal in a flash human nature in all its horror. Seeing this happen has always induced in me a fear great enough to make my hair stand on end, and at the thought that this nature might be one of the prerequisites for survival as a human being, I have come close to despairing of myself. I have always shook with fright before human beings. Unable as I was to feel the least particle of confidence in my ability to speak and act like a human being, I kept my solitary agonies locked in my breast. I kept my melancholy and my agitation hidden, careful lest any trace should be left exposed. I feigned an innocent optimism. I gradually perfected myself in the role of the farcical eccentric. I thought, as long as I can make them laugh, it doesn't matter how, I'll be all right. If I succeed in that, the human beings probably won't mind it too much if I remain outside their lives. The one thing I must avoid is becoming offensive in their eyes. I shall be nothing, the wind, the sky. Design or analysis. My activities as jester, a role born of desperation, were extended even to the servants, whom I feared even more than my family because I found them incomprehensible. In the summer I made everybody laugh by sauntering through the house wearing a red woolen sweater under my cotton kimono. Even my elder brother, who was rarely given to mirth, burst out laughing and commented in intolerably affectionate tones, "That doesn't look so good on you, Yozo." But for all my follies, I was not so insensitive to heat and cold as to walk around in a woolen sweater at the height of summer. I had pulled my little sister's leggings over my arms, letting just enough stick out at the opening of the sleeves to give the impression that I was wearing a sweater. My father frequently had business in Tokyo and maintained a townhouse for that reason. He spent 2 or 3 weeks of the month at a time in the city, always returning laden with a really staggering quantity of presents, not only for members of our immediate family but even for our relatives. It was a kind of hobby on his part. Once, the night before he was to leave for Tokyo, he summoned all the children to the parlor and smilingly asked us what present we would like this time, carefully noting each child's reply in a little book. It was most unusual for father to behave so affectionately with the children. "How about you, Yozo?" he asked, but I could only stammer uncertainly. Whenever I was asked what I wanted, my first impulse was to answer, "Nothing." The thought went through my mind that it didn't make any difference, that nothing was going to make me happy. At the same time, I was congenitally unable to refuse anything offered to me by another person, no matter how little it might suit my tastes. When I hated something, I could not pronounce the words, "I don't like it." When I liked something, I tasted it hesitantly, furtively, as though it were extremely bitter. In either case, I was torn by unspeakable fear. In other words, I hadn't the strength even to choose between two alternatives. In this fact, I believe, lay one of the characteristics which in later years was to develop into a major cause of my life of shame. I remained silent, fidgeting. My father lost a little of his good humor. Will it be a book for you? Or how about a mask for the New Year lion dance? They sell them now in children's sizes. Wouldn't you like one? The fatal words asterisk. Wouldn't you like one? Asterisk made it quite impossible for me to answer. I couldn't even think of any suitably clownish response. The jester had completely failed. A book would be best, I suppose, my brother said seriously. Oh? The pleasure drained from my father's face. He snapped his notebook shut without writing anything. What a failure. Now I had angered my father, and I could be sure that his revenge would be something fearful. That night, as I lay shivering in bed, I tried to think if there were still not some way of redressing the situation. I crept out of bed, tiptoed down to the parlor, and opened the drawer of the desk where my father had most likely put his notebook. I found the book and took it out. I riffled through the pages until I came to the place where he had jotted down our requests for presents. I licked the notebook pencil and wrote in big letters, "Lion Mask." This accomplished, I returned to my bed. I had not the faintest wish for a lion mask. In fact, I would actually have preferred a book. But it was obvious that father wanted to buy me a mask, and my frantic desire to cater to his wishes and restore his good humor had emboldened me to sneak into the parlor in the dead of night. This desperate expedient was rewarded by the great success I had hoped for. When, some days later, my father returned from Tokyo, I overheard him say to mother in his loud voice. I was in the children's room at the time. "What do you think I found when I opened my notebook in the toy shop? See, somebody has written here Lion Mask. It's not my handwriting." For a minute I couldn't figure it out, then it came to me. This was some of Yozo's mischief. You know, I asked him what he wanted from Tokyo, but he just stood there grinning without saying a word. Later he must have got to wanting that lion mask so badly he couldn't stand it. He's certainly a funny kid. Pretends not to know what he wants and then goes and writes it. If he wanted the mask so much, all he had to do was tell me. I burst out laughing in front of everybody in the toy shop. Ask him to come here at once. On another occasion, I assembled all our men and women servants in the foreign-style room. I got one of the men servants to bang at random on the keys of the piano. Our house was well equipped with most amenities, even though we were in the country. And I made everyone roar with laughter by cavorting in a wild Indian dance to his hit-and-miss tune. My brother took a flashbulb photograph of me performing my dance. When the picture was developed, you could see my peepee through the opening between the two handkerchiefs which served for a loincloth, and this too occasioned much merriment. It was perhaps to be accounted a triumph which surpassed my own expectations. I used to subscribe regularly to a dozen or more children's magazines, and for my private reading ordered books of all sorts from Tokyo. I became an adept in the exploits of Dr. Nonsentious and Dr. Know-It-All and was intimately acquainted with all manner of spooky stories, tales of adventure, collections of jokes, songs, and the like. I was never short of material for the absurd stories I solemnly related to make the members of my family laugh. But what of my schooling? I was well on the way to winning respect. But the idea of being respected used to intimidate me excessively. My definition of a respected man was one who had succeeded almost completely in hoodwinking people, but who was finally seen through by some omnipotent person who ruined him and made him suffer a shame worse than death. Even supposing I could deceive most human beings into respecting me, one of them would know the truth, and sooner or later other human beings would learn from him. What would be the wrath and vengeance of those who realized how they had been tricked? That was a hair-raising thought. I acquired my reputation at school less because I was the son of a rich family than because, in the vulgar parlance, I had brains. Being a sickly child, I often missed school for a month or two or even a whole school year at a stretch. Nevertheless, when I returned to school, still convalescent and in a rickshaw, and took the examinations at the end of the year, I was always first in my class, thanks to my brains. I never studied, even when I was well. During recitation time at school, I would draw cartoons, and in the recess periods, I made the other children in the class laugh with the explanations to my drawings. In the composition class, I wrote nothing but funny stories. My teacher admonished me, but that didn't make me stop, for I knew that he secretly enjoyed my stories. One day I submitted a story written in a particularly doleful style, recounting how when I was taken by my mother on the train to Tokyo, I had made water in a spittoon in the corridor. But at the time I had not been ignorant that it was a spittoon. I deliberately made my blunder, pretending a childish innocence. I was so sure that the teacher would laugh that I stealthily followed him to the staff room. As soon as he left the classroom, the teacher pulled out my composition from the stack written by my classmates. He began to read as he walked down the hall and was soon snickering. He went into the staff room, and a minute or so later, was it when he finished it? He burst into loud guffaws, his face scarlet with laughter. I watched him press my paper on the other teachers. I felt very pleased with myself. A mischievous little imp. I had succeeded in appearing mischievous. I had succeeded in escaping from being respected. My report card was all A's except for deportment, where it was never better than a C or a D. This too was a source of great amusement to my family. My true nature, however, was one diametrically opposed to the role of a mischievous imp. Already by that time I had been taught a lamentable thing by the maids and menservants. I was being corrupted. I now think that to perpetrate such a thing on a small child is the ugliest, vilest, crudest crime a human being can commit. But I endured it. I even felt as if it enabled me to see one more particular aspect of human beings. I smiled in my weakness. If I had formed the habit of telling the truth, I might perhaps have been able to confide unabashedly to my father or mother about the crime, but I could not fully understand even my own parents. To appeal for help to any human being, I could expect nothing from that expedient. Supposing I complained to my father or my mother, or to the police, the government, I wondered if in the end I would not be argued into silence by someone in good graces with the world, by the excuses of which the world approved. It is only too obvious that favoritism inevitably exists. It would have been useless to complain to human beings. So I said nothing of the truth. I felt I had no choice but to endure whatever came my way and go on playing the clown. Some perhaps will deride me. What do you mean by not having faith in human beings? When did you become a Christian anyway? I fail to see, however, that a distrust for human beings should necessarily lead directly to religion. Is it not true, rather, that human beings, including those who may now be deriding me, are living in mutual distrust, giving not a thought to God or anything else? There was something that happened when I was a small boy. A celebrated figure of the political party to which my father belonged had come to deliver a speech in our town, and I had been taken by the servants to the theater to hear him. The house was packed. Everybody in town who was especially friendly to my father was present, and enthusiastically applauding. When the speech was over, the audience filtered out in threes and fives into the night. As they set out for home on the snow-covered roads, they were scathingly commenting on the meeting. I could distinguish among the voices those of my father's closest friends, complaining in tones almost of anger about how inept my father's opening remarks had been, and how difficult it was to make head or tail out of the great man's address. Then these men stopped by my house, went into our parlor, and told my father, with expressions of genuine delight on their faces, what a great success the meeting had been. Even the servants, when asked by my mother about the meeting, answered as if it were their spontaneous thought, that it had been really interesting. These were the selfsame servants who had been bitterly complaining on the way home that political meetings are the most boring thing in the world. This, however, is only a minor example. I am convinced that human life is filled with many pure, happy, serene examples of insincerity, truly splendid of their kind, of people deceiving one another without, strangely enough, any wounds being inflicted, of people who seem unaware even that they are deceiving one another. But I have no special interest in instances of mutual deception. I myself spent the whole day long deceiving human beings with my clowning. I have not been able to work up much concern over the morality prescribed in textbooks of ethics under such names as righteousness. I find it difficult to understand the kind of human being who lives, or who is sure he can live, purely, happily, serenely while engaged in deceit. Human beings never did teach me that abstruse secret. If I had only known that one thing, I should never have had to dread human beings so, nor should I have opposed myself to human life, nor tasted such torments of hell every night. In short, I believe that the reason why I did not tell anyone about that loathsome crime perpetrated on me by the servants was not because of distrust for human beings, nor of course because of Christian leanings, but because the human beings around me had rigorously sealed me off from the world of trust or distrust. Even my parents at times displayed attitudes which were hard for me to understand. I also have the impression that many women have been able, instinctively, to sniff out this loneliness of mine, which I confided to no one, and this in later years was to become one of the causes of my being taken advantage of in so many ways. Women found in me a man who could keep a love secret. The second notebook. On the shore, at a point so close to the ocean one might imagine it was there that the waves broke, stood a row of over 20 fairly tall cherry trees with coal-black trunks. Every April, when the new school year was about to begin, these trees would display their dazzling blossoms and their moist brown leaves against the blue of the sea. Soon a snowstorm of blossoms would scatter innumerable petals into the water, flecking the surface with points of white which the waves carried back to the shore. This beach strewn with cherry blossoms served as the playground of the high school I attended. Stylized cherry blossoms flowered even on the badge of the regulation school cap and on the buttons of our uniforms. A distant relative of mine had a house nearby, which was one reason why my father had especially selected for me this school of cherry blossoms by the sea. I was left in the care of the family, whose house was so close to the school that even after the morning bell had rung I could still make it to my class in time if I ran. That was the kind of lazy student I was, but I nevertheless managed, thanks to my accustomed antics, to win popularity with my schoolmates. This was my first experience living in a strange town. I found it far more agreeable than my native place. One might attribute this, perhaps, to the fact that my clowning had by this time become so much a part of me that it was no longer such a strain to trick others. I wonder, though, if it was not due instead to the incontestable difference in the problem involved in performing before one's own family and strangers, or in one's own town and elsewhere. This problem exists no matter how great a genius one may be. An actor dreads most the audience in his hometown. I imagine the greatest actor in the world would be quite paralyzed in a room where all his family and relatives were gathered to watch him. But I had learned to play my part. I had, moreover, been quite a success. It was inconceivable that so talented an actor would fail away from home. The fear of human beings continued to writhe in my breast. I am not sure whether more or less intensely than before, but my acting talents had unquestionably matured. I could always convulse the classroom with laughter, and even as the teacher protested what a good class it would be if only I were not in it, he would be laughing behind his hand. At a word from me, even the military drill instructor, whose more usual idiom was a barbarous, thunderous roar, would burst into helpless laughter. Just when I had begun to relax my guard a bit, fairly confident that I had succeeded by now in concealing completely my true identity, I was stabbed in the back, quite unexpectedly. The assailant, like most people who stab in the back, bordered on being a simpleton, the puniest boy in the class, whose scrofulous face and floppy jacket with sleeves too long for him was complemented by a total lack of proficiency in his studies, and by such clumsiness in military drill and physical training that he was perpetually designated as an onlooker. Not surprisingly, I failed to recognize the need to be on my guard against him. That day Teichi, that was the boy's name, as I recall, was, as usual, onlooking, during the physical training period while the rest of us drilled on the horizontal bar. Deliberately assuming as solemn a face as I could muster, I lunged overhead at the bar, shouting with the effort. I missed the bar and sailed on as if I were making a broad jump, landing with a thud in the sand on the seat of my pants. This failure was entirely premeditated, but everybody burst out laughing, exactly as I had planned. I got to my feet with a rueful smile and was brushing the sand from my pants when Teichi, who had crept up from somewhere behind, poked me in the back. He murmured, "You did it on purpose." I trembled all over. I might have guessed that someone would detect that I had deliberately missed the bar, but that Teichi should have been the one came as a bolt from the blue. I felt as if I had seen the world before me burst in an instant into the raging flames of hell. It was all I could do to suppress a wild shriek of terror. The ensuing days were imprinted with my anxiety and dread. I continued on the surface, making everybody laugh with my miserable clowning, but now and then painful sighs escaped my lips. Whatever I did, Teichi would see through it, and I was sure he would soon start spreading the word to everyone he saw. At this thought my forehead broke out in a sweat. I stared around me vacantly with the wild eyes of a madman. If it were possible, I felt, I would like to keep a 24-hour-a-day surveillance over Teichi, never stirring from him, morning, noon, or night, to make sure that he did not divulge the secret. I brooded over what I should do. I would devote the hours spent with him to persuading him that my antics were not, on purpose, but the genuine article. If things went well, I would like to become his inseparable friend, but if this proved utterly impossible, I had no choice but to pray for his death. Typically enough, the one thing that never occurred to me was to kill him. During the course of my life, I have wished innumerable times that I might meet with a violent death, but I have never once desired to kill anybody. I thought that in killing a dreaded adversary I might actually be bringing him happiness. In order to win over Teichi, I clothed my face in the gentle, beguiling smile of the false Christian. I strolled everywhere with him, my arm lightly around his scrawny shoulders, my head tilted affectionately towards him. I frequently would invite him in honeyed, cajoling tones to come and play in the house where I was lodging. But instead of an answer, he always gave me only blank stares in return. One day after school was let out, it must have been in the early summer, there was a sudden downpour. The other students were making a great fuss about getting back to their lodgings, but since I lived just around the corner, I decided to make a dash for it. Just as I was about to rush outside, I noticed Teichi hovering dejectedly in the entranceway. I said, "Let's go. I'll lend you my umbrella." I grabbed Teichi's hand as he hesitated, and ran out with him into the rain. When we arrived home, I asked my aunt to dry our jackets. I had succeeded in luring Teichi to my room. The household consisted of my aunt, a woman in her 50s, and my two cousins, the older of whom was a tall, frail, bespectacled girl of about 30. She had been married at one time but was later separated, and the younger a short, round-faced girl who looked fresh out of high school. The ground floor of the house was given over to a shop where small quantities of stationery supplies and sporting goods were offered for sale, but the principal source of income was the rent from the 5 or 6 tenements built by my late uncle. Teichi, standing haplessly in my room, said, "My ears hurt. They must have got wet in the rain." I examined his ears and discovered they were both running horribly. The lobes seemed filled to the bursting with pus. I simulated an exaggerated concern. "This looks terrible. It must hurt." Then, in the gentle tones a woman might use, I apologized. "I'm so sorry I dragged you out in all this rain." I went downstairs to fetch some cotton wool and alcohol. Teichi lay on the floor with his head on my lap, and I painstakingly swabbed his ears. Even Teichi seemed not to be aware of the hypocrisy, the scheming, behind my actions. Far from it, his comment as he lay there with his head pillowed in my lap was, "I'll bet lots of women will fall for you." It was his illiterate approximation of a compliment. This, I was to learn in later years, was a kind of demoniacal prophecy, more horrible than Teichi could have realized. To fall for, to be fallen for. I feel in these words something unspeakably vulgar, farcical, and at the same time extraordinarily complacent. Once these expressions put in an appearance, no matter how solemn the place, the silent cathedrals of melancholy crumble, leaving nothing but an impression of fatuousness. It is curious, but the cathedrals of melancholy are not necessarily demolished if one can replace the vulgar. What a messy business it is to be fallen for. By the more literary. What uneasiness lies in being loved. Teichi uttered that idiotic compliment, that women would fall for me, because I had been kind enough to clean the discharge from his ears. My reaction at the time was merely to blush and smile, without saying a word in return, but to tell the truth, I already had a faint inkling of what his prophecy implied. No, to speak in those terms of the atmosphere engendered by so vulgar an expression as to fall for, is to betray a precocity of sentiment not even worthy of the dialogue of the romantic lead in a musical comedy. I certainly was not moved by the farcical, self-satisfied emotions suggested by the phrase. To have a faint inkling. I have always found the female of the human species many times more difficult to understand than the male. In my immediate family, women outnumbered the men, and many of my cousins were girls. There was also the maidservant of the crime. I think it would be no exaggeration to say that my only playmates while I was growing up were girls. Nevertheless, it was with very much the sensation of treading on thin ice that I associated with these girls. I could almost never guess their motives. I was in the dark. At times I made indiscreet mistakes which brought me painful wounds. These wounds, unlike the scars from the lashing a man might give, cut inwards very deep, like an internal hemorrhage, bringing intense discomfort. Once inflicted, it was extremely hard to recover from such wounds. Women led me on only to throw me aside. They mocked and tortured me when others were around, only to embrace me with passion as soon as everyone had left. Women sleep so soundly they seem to be dead. Who knows? Women may live in order to sleep. These and various other generalizations were products of an observation of women since boyhood days, but my conclusion was that though women appear to belong to the same species as man, they are actually quite different creatures, and these incomprehensible, insidious beings have, fantastic as it seems, always looked after me. In my case, such an expression as to be fallen for, or even to be loved, is not in the least appropriate. Perhaps it describes the situation more accurately to say that I was looked after. Women were also less demanding than men when it came to my clowning. When I played the jester, men did not go on laughing indefinitely. I knew that if I got carried away by my success in entertaining a man and overdid the role, my comedy would fall flat, and I was always careful to quit at a suitable place. Women, on the other hand, have no sense of moderation. No matter how long I went on with my antics, they would ask for more, and I would become exhausted responding to their insatiable demands for encores. They really laugh an amazing amount of the time. I suppose one can say that women stuff themselves with far more pleasures than men. The two cousins in whose house I was living while attending school used to visit my room whenever they had the time. Their knock on my door, no matter how often it came, never failed to startle me so that I almost jumped in fright. "Are you studying?" "No," I would say with a smile, shutting my book. I would launch into some silly story, miles removed from what I was thinking. "Today at school the geography teacher, the one we call the walrus." One evening, my cousins came to my room and, after they had compelled me to clown at unmerciful lengths, one of them proposed, "Yozo, let's see how you look with glasses on." "Why?" "Don't make such a fuss. Put them on. Here, take these glasses." They invariably spoke in the same harsh, peremptory tones. The clown meekly put on the older girl's glasses. My cousins were convulsed with laughter. "You look exactly like him. Exactly like Harold Lloyd." The American movie comedian was very popular at the time in Japan. I stood up. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, raising one arm in greeting, "I should like on this occasion to thank all my Japanese fans." I went through the motions of making a speech. They laughed all the harder. From then on, whenever a Harold Lloyd movie came to town, I went to see it and secretly studied his expressions. One autumn evening, as I was lying in bed reading a book, the older of my cousins, I always called her sister, suddenly darted into my room quick as a bird, and collapsed over my bed. She whispered through her tears, "Yozo, you'll help me, I know. I know you will. Let's run away from this terrible house together. Oh, help me, please." She continued in this hysterical vein for a while, only to burst into tears again. This was not the first time that a woman had put on such a scene before me, and sister's excessively emotional words did not surprise me much. I felt instead a certain boredom at their banality and emptiness. I slipped out of bed, went to my desk, and picked up a persimmon. I peeled it and offered sister a section. She ate it, still sobbing, and said, Have you any interesting books? Lend me something. I chose Soseki's I Am a Cat from my bookshelf and handed it to her. Thanks for the persimmon, Sister said as she left the room, an embarrassed smile on her face. Sister was not the only one. I have often felt that I would find it more complicated, troublesome, and unpleasant to ascertain the feelings by which a woman lives than to plumb the innermost thoughts of an earthworm. Long personal experience had taught me that when a woman suddenly bursts into hysterics, the way to restore her spirits is to give her something sweet. Her younger sister, Sechan, would even bring friends to my room, and in my usual fashion I amused them all with perfect impartiality. As soon as a friend had left, Sechan would tell me disagreeable things about her, inevitably concluding, "She's a bad girl. You must be careful of her." If that's the case, I wanted to say, "You needn't have gone to the trouble of bringing her here." Thanks to Sechan, almost all the visitors to my room were girls. This, however, by no means implies that Teichi's compliment, "Women fall for you," had as yet been realized. I was merely the Harold Lloyd of Northeast Japan. Not for some years would Teichi's silly statement come palpitatingly alive, metamorphosed into a sinister prophecy. Teichi made one other important gift to me. One day he came to my room to play. He was waving a brightly colored picture which he proudly displayed. "It's a picture of a ghost," he explained. I was startled. That instant, as I could not help feeling in later years, determined my path of escape. I knew what Teichi was showing me. I knew that it was only the familiar self-portrait of Van Gogh. When we were children, the French Impressionist school was very popular in Japan, and our first introduction to an appreciation of Western painting most often began with such works. The paintings of Van Gogh, Gauguin, Cézanne, and Renoir were familiar even to students at country schools, mainly through photographic reproductions. I myself had seen quite a few colored photographs of Van Gogh's paintings. His brushwork and the vividness of his colors had intrigued me, but I had never imagined his pictures to be of ghosts. I took from my bookshelf a volume of Modigliani reproductions and showed Teichi the familiar nudes with skin the color of burnished copper. "How about these? Do you suppose they're ghosts too? They're terrific." Teichi widened his eyes in admiration. "This one looks like a horse out of hell. They really are ghosts then, aren't they? I wish I could paint pictures of ghosts like that," said Teichi. There are some people whose dread of human beings is so morbid that they reach a point where they yearn to see with their own eyes monsters of ever more horrible shapes. And the more nervous they are, the quicker to take fright, the more violent they pray that every storm will be. Painters who have had this mentality, after repeated wounds and intimidations at the hands of the apparitions called human beings, have often come to believe in phantasms. They plainly saw monsters in broad daylight, in the midst of nature. And they did not fob people off with clowning. They did their best to depict these monsters just as they had appeared. Teichi was right. They had dared to paint pictures of devils. These, I thought, would be my friends in the future. I was so excited I could have wept. "I'm going to paint too. I'm going to paint pictures of ghosts and devils and horses out of hell." My voice as I spoke these words to Teichi was lowered to a barely audible whisper. Why, I don't know. Ever since elementary school days, I enjoyed drawing and looking at pictures. But my pictures failed to win the reputation among my fellow students that my comic stories did. I have never had the least trust in the opinions of human beings, and my stories represented to me nothing more than the clown's gesture of greeting to his audience. They enraptured all of my teachers, but for me they were devoid of the slightest interest. Only to my paintings, to the depiction of the object, my cartoons were something else again, did I devote any real efforts of my original, though childish, style. The copybooks for drawing we used at school were dreary, the teachers' pictures were incredibly inept, and I was obliged to experiment for myself entirely without direction, using every method of expression which came to me. I owned a set of oil paints and brushes from the time I entered high school. I sought to model my techniques on those of the Impressionist school, but my pictures remained flat as paper cutouts, and seemed to offer no promise of ever developing into anything. But Teichi's words made me aware that my mental attitude toward painting had been completely mistaken. What superficiality, and what stupidity, there is in trying to depict in a pretty manner things which one has thought pretty. The masters, through their subjective perceptions, created beauty out of trivialities. They did not hide their interest even in things which were nauseatingly ugly, but soaked themselves in the pleasure of depicting them. In other words, they seemed not to rely in the least on the misconceptions of others. Now that I had been initiated by Teichi into these root secrets of the art of painting, I began to do a few self-portraits, taking care that they not be seen by my female visitors. The pictures I drew were so heartrending as to stupefy even myself. Here was the true self I had so desperately hidden. I had smiled cheerfully, I had made others laugh, but this was the harrowing reality. I secretly affirmed this self, was sure that there was no escape from it, but naturally, I did not show my pictures to anyone except Teichi. I disliked the thought that I might suddenly be subjected to their suspicious vigilance, once the nightmarish reality under the clowning was detected. On the other hand, I was equally afraid that they might not recognize my true self when they saw it, but imagine that it was just some new twist to my clowning, occasion for additional snickers. This would have been most painful of all. I therefore hid the pictures in the back of my cupboard. In school drawing classes, I also kept secret my ghost style techniques and continued to paint as before in the conventional idiom of pretty things. To Teichi, and to him alone, I could display my easily wounded sensibilities, and I did not hesitate now to show him my self-portraits. He was very enthusiastic, and I painted 2 or 3 more, plus a picture of a ghost, earning from Teichi the prediction, "You'll be a great painter someday." Not long afterward, I went up to Tokyo. On my forehead were imprinted the 2 prophecies uttered by half-wit Teichi, that I would be fallen for, and that I would become a great painter. I wanted to enter an art school, but my father put me into college, intending eventually to make a civil servant out of me. This was the sentence passed on me, and I, who have never been able to answer back, dumbly obeyed. At my father's suggestion, I took the college entrance examinations a year early, and I passed. By this time I was really quite weary of my high school by the sea and the cherry blossoms. Once in Tokyo, I immediately began life in a dormitory, but the squalor and violence appalled me. This time I was in no mood for clowning. I got the doctor to certify that my lungs were affected. I left the dormitory and went to live in my father's townhouse in Ueno. Communal living had proved quite impossible for me. It gave me chills just to hear such words as the ardor of youth, or youthful pride. I could not by any stretch of the imagination soak myself in college spirit. The classrooms and the dormitories seemed like the dumping grounds of distorted sexual desires, and even my virtually perfected antics were of no use there. When the diet was not in session, my father spent only a week or 2 of the month at the house. While he was away, there would be just 3 of us in the rather imposing mansion, an elderly couple who looked after the premises and myself. I frequently cut classes, but not because I felt like sightseeing in Tokyo. It looks as if I shall end my days without ever having seen the Meiji Shrine, the statue of Kusunoki Masashige, or the tombs of the 47 Ronin. Instead, I would spend whole days in the house reading and painting. When my father was in town, I set out for school promptly every morning, although sometimes I actually went to an art class given by a painter in Hongo, and practiced sketching for 3 or 4 hours at a time with him. Having been able to escape from the college dormitory, I felt rather cynically, this may have been my own bias, that I was now in a rather special position. Even if I attended lectures, it was more like an auditor than a regular student. Attending classes became all the more tedious. I had gone through elementary and high schools and was now in college without ever having been able to understand what was meant by school spirit. I never even tried to learn the school songs. Before long, a student at the art class was to initiate me into the mysteries of drink, cigarettes, prostitutes, pawnshops, and left-wing thought. A strange combination, but it actually happened that way. This student's name was Masao Hariki. He had been born in downtown Tokyo, was 6 years older than myself, and was a graduate of a private art school. Having no atelier at home, he used to attend the art class I frequented, where he was supposedly continuing his study of oil painting. One day, When we still barely knew each other by sight, we hadn't as yet exchanged a word, he suddenly said to me, "Can you lend me 5 yen?" I was so taken aback that I ended up giving him the money. "That's fine," he said. "Now for some liquor. You're my guest." I couldn't very well refuse, and I was dragged off to a cafe near the school. This marked the beginning of our friendship. "I've been noticing you for quite a while." There. That bashful smile, that's the special mark of the promising artist. Now, as a pledge of our friendship, bottoms up. He called one of the waitresses to our table. "Isn't he a handsome boy? You mustn't fall for him, now. I'm sorry to say it, but ever since he appeared in our art class, I've only been the second handsomest." Hariki was swarthy, but his features were regular and most unusual for an art student. He always wore a neat suit and a conservative necktie. His hair was pomaded and parted in the middle. The surroundings were unfamiliar to me. I kept folding and unfolding my arms nervously, and my smiles now were really bashful. Cleaned up too. The copybooks for drawing we used at school were dreary. The teacher's pictures were incredibly inept, and I was obliged to experiment for myself entirely without direction, using every method of expression which came to me. I owned a set of oil paints and brushes from the time I entered high school. I sought to model my techniques on those of the Impressionist school, but my pictures remained flat as paper cutouts, and seemed to offer no promise of ever developing into anything. But Teichi's words made me aware that my mental attitude toward painting had been completely mistaken. What superficiality, and what stupidity, there is in trying to depict in a pretty manner things which one has thought pretty. The masters, through their subjective perceptions, created beauty out of trivialities. They did not hide their interest even in things which were nauseatingly ugly, but soaked themselves in the pleasure of depicting them. In other words, they seemed not to rely in the least on the misconceptions of others. Now that I had been initiated by Teichi into these root secrets of the art of painting, I began to do a few self-portraits, taking care that they not be seen by my female visitors. The pictures I drew were so heartrending as to stupefy even myself. Here was the true self I had so desperately hidden. I had smiled cheerfully. I had made others laugh, but this was the harrowing reality. I secretly affirmed this self, was sure that there was no escape from it, but naturally, I did not show my pictures to anyone except Teichi. I disliked the thought that I might suddenly be subjected to their suspicious vigilance, once the nightmarish reality under the clowning was detected. On the other hand, I was equally afraid that they might not recognize my true self when they saw it, but imagine that it was just some new twist to my clowning, occasion for additional snickers. This would have been most painful of all. I therefore hid the pictures in the back of my cupboard. In school drawing classes, I also kept secret my ghost style techniques and continued to paint as before in the conventional idiom of pretty things. To Teichi, and to him alone, I could display my easily wounded sensibilities, and I did not hesitate now to show him my self-portraits. He was very enthusiastic, and I painted 2 or 3 more, plus a picture of a ghost, earning from Teichi the prediction, "You'll be a great painter someday." Not long afterward, I went up to Tokyo. On my forehead were imprinted the 2 prophecies uttered by half-wit Teichi, that I would be fallen for, and that I would become a great painter. I wanted to enter an art school, but my father put me into college, intending eventually to make a civil servant out of me. This was the sentence passed on me, and I, who have never been able to answer back, dumbly obeyed. At my father's suggestion, I took the college entrance examinations a year early, and I passed. By this time I was really quite weary of my high school by the sea and the cherry blossoms. Once in Tokyo, I immediately began life in a dormitory, but the squalor and violence appalled me. This time I was in no mood for clowning. I got the doctor to certify that my lungs were affected. I left the dormitory and went to live in my father's townhouse in Ueno. Communal living had proved quite impossible for me. It gave me chills just to hear such words as the ardor of youth, or youthful pride. I could not by any stretch of the imagination soak myself in college spirit. The classrooms and the dormitory seemed like the dumping grounds of distorted sexual desires, and even my virtually perfected antics were of no use there. When the diet was not in session, my father spent only a week or two of the month at the house. While he was away, there would be just 3 of us in the rather imposing mansion, an elderly couple who looked after the premises and myself. I frequently cut classes, but not because I felt like sightseeing in Tokyo. It looks as if I shall end my days without ever having seen the Meiji Shrine, the statue of Kusunoki Masashige, or the tombs of the 47 Ronin. Instead, I would spend whole days in the house reading and painting. When my father was in town, I set out for school promptly every morning, although sometimes I actually went to an art class given by a painter in Hongo, and practiced sketching for 3 or 4 hours at a time with him. Having been able to escape from the college dormitory, I felt rather cynically, this may have been my own bias, that I was now in a rather special position. Even if I attended lectures, it was more like an auditor than a regular student. Attending classes became all the more tedious. I had gone through elementary and high schools and was now in college without ever having been able to understand what was meant by school spirit. I never even tried to learn the school songs. Before long, a student at the art class was to initiate me into the mysteries of drink, cigarettes, prostitutes, pawnshops, and left-wing thought. A strange combination, but it actually happened that way. This student's name was Masao Hariki. He had been born in downtown Tokyo, was 6 years older than myself, and was a graduate of a private art school. Having no atelier at home, he used to attend the art class I frequented, where he was supposedly continuing his study of oil painting. One day, when we still barely knew each other by sight, we hadn't as yet exchanged a word, he suddenly said to me, "Can you lend me 5 yen?" I was so taken aback that I ended up giving him the money. "That's fine," he said. "Now for some liquor. You're my guest." I couldn't very well refuse, and I was dragged off to a cafe near the school. This marked the beginning of our friendship. "I've been noticing you for quite a while. There. That bashful smile, that's the special mark of the promising artist. Now, as a pledge of our friendship, bottoms up." He called one of the waitresses to our table. "Isn't he a handsome boy? You mustn't fall for him, now. I'm sorry to say it, but ever since he appeared in our art class, I've only been the second handsomest." Hariki was swarthy, but his features were regular and, most unusual for an art student, he always wore a neat suit and a conservative necktie. His hair was pomaded and parted in the middle. The surroundings were unfamiliar to me. I kept folding and unfolding my arms nervously, and my smiles now were really bashful. Let me know if you'd like the next part edited too. It caused me a bitterness akin to shame to have this pointed out by someone like Hariki. At the same time, I suddenly lost all interest in prostitutes. To show off his modernity, I can't think of any other reason, Hariki also took me one day to a secret communist meeting. I don't remember exactly what it was called, perhaps a reading society. A secret communist meeting may have been, for Hariki, just one more of the sights of Tokyo. I was introduced to the comrades, and obliged to buy a pamphlet. Then I heard a lecture on Marxian economics delivered by an extraordinarily ugly young man, the guest of honor. Everything he said seemed exceedingly obvious, and undoubtedly true, but I felt sure that something more obscure, more frightening, lurked in the hearts of human beings. Greed did not cover it, nor did vanity. Nor was it simply a combination of lust and greed. I wasn't sure what it was, but I felt that there was something inexplicable at the bottom of human society, something not reducible to economics. Terrified as I was by this weird element, I assented to materialism as naturally as water finds its own level. But materialism could not free me from my dread of human beings. I could not feel the joy of hope a man experiences when he opens his eyes on young leaves. Nevertheless, I regularly attended the meetings of the Reading Society. I found it uproariously amusing to see my comrades, their faces tense as though they were discussing matters of life and death, absorbed in the study of theories so elementary they were on the order of 1 and 1 makes 2. I tried to take some of the strain out of the meetings with my usual antics. That was why, I imagine, the oppressive atmosphere of the group gradually relaxed. I came to be so popular that I was considered indispensable at the meetings. These simple people perhaps fancied that I was just as simple as they were, an optimistic, laughter-loving comrade, but if such was their view, I was deceiving them completely. I was not their comrade. Yet I attended every single meeting and performed for them my full repertoire of farce. I did it because I liked to, because those people pleased me, not necessarily because we were linked by any common affection derived from Marx. Irrationality. I found the thought faintly pleasurable. Or rather, I felt at ease with it. What frightened me was the logic of the world, in it lay the foretaste of something incalculably powerful. Its mechanism was incomprehensible, and I could not possibly remain closeted in that windowless, bone-chilling room. Though outside lay the sea of irrationality, it was far more agreeable to swim in its waters, until, presently, I drowned. People talk of social outcasts. The words apparently denote the miserable losers of the world, the vicious ones, but I feel as though I have been a social outcast from the moment I was born. If ever I meet someone society has designated as an outcast, I invariably feel affection for him, an emotion which carries me away in melting tenderness. People also talk of a criminal consciousness. All my life in this world of human beings I have been tortured by such a consciousness, but it has been my faithful companion, like a wife in poverty, and together, just the two of us, we have indulged in our forlorn pleasures. This, perhaps, has been one of the attitudes in which I have gone on living. People commonly speak of the wound of a guilty conscience. In my case, the wound appeared of itself when I was an infant, and with the passage of time, far from healing, it has only grown deeper, until now it has reached the bone. The agonies I have suffered, night after night, have made for a hell composed of an infinite diversity of tortures. But though this is a very strange way to put it, the wound has gradually become dearer to me than my own flesh and blood, and I have come to think its pain to be the emotion of the wound as it lived, or even its murmur of affection. For such a person as myself, the atmosphere of an underground movement was curiously soothing and agreeable. What appealed to me, in other words, was not so much its basic aims as its personality. The movement served Hariki merely as a pretext for idiotic banter. The only meeting he attended was the one where he introduced me. He gave as his reason for not coming again the stupid joke that Marxists should study not only the productive aspects of society but the consumptive ones. At any rate, the consumptive aspects were the only ones we observed together. When I think back on it now, in those days there were Marxists of every variety. Some, like Hariki, called themselves such out of an empty modernity. An attraction to its odor of irrationality led others, like myself, to participate in the movement. I am sure that if the true believers in Marxism had discovered what Hariki and I were really interested in, they would have been furious with us and driven us out immediately as vile traitors. Strange to say, however, neither Hariki nor I ever came close to being expelled. On the contrary, I felt so much more relaxed in this irrational world than in the world of rational gentlemen that I was able to do what was expected of me in a sound manner. I was therefore considered a promising comrade and entrusted with various jobs fraught with a ludicrous degree of secrecy. As a matter of fact, I never once refused any of their jobs. Curiously docile, I performed whatever they asked of me with such unruffled assurance that the dogs, that was the name by which the comrades referred to the police, suspected nothing, and I was never so much as picked up for questioning. Smiling, making others smile, I punctiliously acquitted myself of all their dangerous missions. The people in the movement observed such excessive precautions, they were perpetually prey to life and death tensions, as to suggest some clumsy imitation of a detective novel. The missions on which I was employed were really of a stupefying inconsequentiality, but the comrades kept themselves worked up into a state of frantic excitement by incessantly reminding themselves how dangerous these errands were. I felt at the time that if I should become a party member and got caught, not even the prospect of spending the rest of my life in prison would bother me. It occurred to me that prison life might actually be pleasanter than groaning away my sleepless nights in a hellish dread of the realities of life, as led by human beings. Even when my father and I were living in the same house, he was kept so busy receiving guests or going out that sometimes 3 or 4 days would pass without our seeing each other. This, however, did not make his presence any the less oppressive and intimidating. I was just thinking, without yet daring to propose it, how I would like to leave the house and find lodgings elsewhere, when I learned from our old caretaker that my father apparently intended to sell the house. Father's term of office as a member of the Diet would soon expire, and, doubtless for many reasons, he seemed to have no intention of standing for election again. Perhaps, I do not pretend to understand my father's thoughts any better than those of a stranger. He had decided to build a retreat somewhere back home. He never had felt much affection for Tokyo, and he must have concluded that it was pointless to maintain a house with servants just for the convenience of a mere college student like myself. The next part cleaned up too. At any rate, the house was sold before long, and I moved into a gloomy room in an old lodging house in Hongo, where I was immediately beset by financial worries. My father had been giving me a fixed monthly allowance, which would disappear in 2 or 3 days. But back when I lived at home, there were always cigarettes, liquor, and fruit available, and I could charge books, stationery, and clothing at nearby shops. If it was a store my father patronized, it didn't matter if I walked out without so much as an explanation. Then suddenly, I was thrown on my own in lodgings and had to survive on that same monthly allowance, sent from home. I was completely at my wits' end. The money vanished in the usual 2 or 3 days, and I would be nearly wild with fright and despair. I sent out barrages of telegrams begging for money, from my father, my brothers, my sisters, each in turn. The telegrams were followed by letters filled with explanations, every one of them absurd fabrications. I thought it a good strategy to make people laugh when asking them for favors. Under Hariki's tutelage, I also began to frequent the pawnshops. Despite everything, I was chronically short of money, and I was incapable of living all by myself in those lodgings, where I didn't know a soul. It terrified me to sit quietly in my room alone. I felt as if someone might suddenly strike me or burst in to attack me. I rushed outside, either to assist with movement activities or to make the rounds of bars with Hariki, drinking cheap sake wherever we went. I almost completely neglected both my schoolwork and my painting. Then, in November of my 2nd year in college, I became involved in a love suicide with a married woman older than myself. That changed everything. I had already stopped attending classes and no longer spent even a minute studying. Amazingly, I still managed to give sensible answers on exams and kept my family under the illusion that all was well. But eventually, my poor attendance prompted the school to send my father a confidential report. My elder brother, acting on my father's behalf, sent me a long, sternly worded letter warning me to change my ways. But more pressing than the shame of that letter were my worsening money troubles and the increasingly frenzied demands of the movement. The jobs were no longer something I could approach half in jest. I had somehow become the leader of all the Marxist student action groups across central Tokyo. I ran about constantly, maintaining liaison. In my raincoat pocket I carried a small knife I'd bought in case of an armed uprising. I remember now it had a delicate blade, barely strong enough to sharpen a pencil. My fondest wish was simply to drink myself into unconsciousness, but I didn't have the money. The party's requests for my help came so often and so urgently that I could barely catch my breath. My frail body wasn't built for such frantic activity. I had only ever joined the group out of fascination with its irrationality, and now I was horribly entangled in what had started as a joke. Secretly, I wanted to tell them, "This isn't my business. Why don't you get a real party man to do it?" Unable to suppress such thoughts, I escaped. I fled, but the escape gave me no joy. I decided to kill myself. At that time, 3 women showed me special affection. One of them was the landlord's daughter at my lodging house. When I came back exhausted from my errands for the movement, and collapsed into bed without even eating, she would always come up to my room, carrying a writing pad and pen. "Excuse me. It's so noisy downstairs with my sister and little brother that I can't collect my thoughts to write a letter," she'd say. Then she'd seat herself at my desk and write, sometimes for over an hour. It would have been easier to pretend I was asleep and ignore her, but her expression clearly showed she wanted me to talk. Though I had no desire to say a single word, I gave in with my usual spirit of passive service. I'd roll over on my stomach, grunt, puff on a cigarette, and begin. I'm told some men heat bathwater by burning the love letters they get from women. How horrid! It must be you. As a matter of fact, I boiled milk that way, and drunk it too. What an honor for the girl! Use mine next time! If only she would just leave. Letter indeed. What a transparent excuse. I was sure she was just writing the alphabet, or the days of the week. Show me what you've written, I said, although I desperately wanted to avoid seeing it. No, I won't, she protested. Oh, you're dreadful. Her joy was so indecent it chilled any feeling I might have had for her. I thought up an errand to send her away. Sorry to bother you, but would you mind going down to the drugstore and buying me some sleeping tablets? I'm overexhausted. My face is burning, I can't sleep. Sorry, and about the money. That's all right. Don't worry about the money. She got up happily. I was well aware that women are never offended when asked to do an errand. They're delighted when a man deigns to ask them for a favor. The second girl who showed interest in me was a comrade, a student at a teacher's training college. My activities in the movement meant I had to see her every day, unpleasant though it was. Even after our work for the day was done, she would stubbornly follow me around. She bought me random gifts and offered them with the words, I wish you'd think of me as your real sister. Wincing at the sentiment, I'd reply, I do, and force a sad little smile. I was afraid to offend her, and all I thought about was how to delay or avoid a confrontation. As a result, I found myself spending more and more time dancing attendance on that ugly, unpleasant girl. I let her buy me presents, each more garish and tasteless than the last, and usually gave them to the postman or grocery boy. I tried to look cheerful in her presence, and made her laugh with my usual jokes. One summer evening she simply wouldn't leave me. Hoping to get rid of her, I kissed her when we passed through a dark part of the street. She became uncontrollably, shamefully excited. She hailed a taxi and took me to a small room the movement secretly rented in an office building. We spent the night there in a chaotic frenzy. What an extraordinary sister I have, I told myself with a wry smile. There was no avoiding either the landlord's daughter or this comrade. Every day I bumped into them. I couldn't dodge them as I had other women before. Before I even realized what was happening, my chronic insecurity had driven me into desperate efforts to ingratiate myself with both of them. It was as if I were bound to them by some ancient debt. It was around the same time that I became the unexpected recipient of kindness from a waitress at one of those big cafes on the Ginza. After just one meeting, I was so completely tied to her by a sense of gratitude that worry and fear utterly paralyzed me. Or thematic breakdown. By this time, I had learned to simulate the audacity needed to board a streetcar alone, go to the kabuki theater, or even visit a cafe without Hariki's guidance. Inwardly, I remained just as wary of human boldness and violence, but outwardly I had begun, bit by bit, to master the art of facing people with a straight expression. No, that's not quite accurate. I have never truly been able to face people without an accompaniment of painful smiles, the buffoonery of defeat. What I had acquired was merely the ability to stammer through the necessary small talk, as if dazed. Was this a result of my work with the movement? Of women? Of liquor? Perhaps it was being constantly short of money that honed this skill the most. I felt afraid no matter where I was. I began to wonder whether the best way to find some relief from that constant fear might not be to lose myself in the din of a large cafe, surrounded by drunken patrons, waitresses, and porters. With that thought in mind, I went one day alone to a cafe on the Ginza. I had only 10 yen on me. Sitting beside a hostess, I said with a smile, All I've got is 10 yen. Consider yourself warned. You needn't worry, she replied, with a faint Kansai accent. It was strange how those few words soothed my agitation. It wasn't just the relief of not having to worry about money. Something in her presence made worrying seem unnecessary. I drank quietly. She didn't intimidate me, and I didn't feel the need to perform my usual clownish antics. I drank in silence, allowing my natural gloom and taciturnity to show. She placed various appetizers on the table in front of me. "Do you like them?" I shook my head. "Only liquor? I'll have a drink too." It was a cold autumn night. I was waiting at a sushi stall behind the ginza for Tsuniko. Yes, I believe that was her name, though my memory is blurred. I'm the sort of person who can forget even the name of the woman with whom he attempted suicide. The sushi I was eating had nothing to recommend it. Why, when I've forgotten her name, can I remember so clearly how bad the sushi tasted? I remember the old man who made it, his head close-cropped, his face snake-like, wagging from side to side as he worked, trying to give the impression of expertise. I've seen people on the streetcar 2 or 3 times since whose faces seemed familiar, only to realize they reminded me of that sushi vendor. Now, when I can't recall her name or face, the fact that I remember that old man's face in such detail, enough to draw it, is surely proof of how cold and distressing that meal was. Even when taken to restaurants famous for sushi, I've never enjoyed it much. Tsuniko lived in a rented room on the 2nd floor of a carpenter's house. I lay on the floor, sipping tea, propping my cheek with one hand as if I had a terrible toothache. I didn't bother to hide my habitual gloom. Oddly enough, she seemed to enjoy seeing me like that. She gave the impression of being utterly alone, as if an icy storm swirled around her, leaving only dead leaves whirling in the wind. As we lay together, she told me she was 2 years older than I was, and that she came from Hiroshima. "I've got a husband, you know. He used to be a barber in Hiroshima. We ran off to Tokyo at the end of last year. But he couldn't find decent work. Before long, he got picked up for swindling someone, and now he's in jail. I've been going to visit him every day, but starting tomorrow I won't go anymore." She rambled on, but I have never been able to get interested in women's stories about themselves. Maybe it's because they're poor storytellers, emphasizing all the wrong details. Or maybe it's something else. In any case, I always tune them out. I feel so unhappy. If I could just hear that one simple phrase whispered to me, it would move me more than the longest, most detailed account of a woman's life. But I have never once heard a woman say it. This one didn't say it either, but a silent current of misery, no more than an inch wide, flowed across her body. When I lay next to her, that current enveloped mine, mingling with my own deeper stream of gloom like a withered leaf settling on stones at the bottom of a pool. For the first time, I was free from fear and anxiety. It was entirely different from the restful sleep I had experienced in the arms of prostitutes, who, at least, were cheerful. The night I spent with that criminal's wife was a night of liberation and happiness. I doubt I will ever again use so bold a word, *happiness*, so directly, without hesitation, in these notebooks. But it lasted only one night. When I awoke and got out of bed in the morning, I was once again the shallow poser, the clown. The weak fear happiness itself. They can injure themselves on cotton wool. Even happiness can wound them. I was impatient to leave while things were still intact, before the damage was done, and so I hid behind my usual smokescreen of farce. They say love flies out the window when poverty comes in the door, I quipped. But most people get the meaning backwards. It's not that when a man's money runs out, the woman leaves him. When he's broke, he gets depressed. His laugh loses its strength. He turns bitter. Finally, in despair, he shakes her off. The proverb really means that when a man starts going mad, he shakes and shakes until he's rid of the woman. You'll find that definition in the Kanazawa dictionary, more's the pity. I think I understand it myself. I remember making Tsuniko laugh with remarks like that. I was trying to leave quickly, without even washing my face. I knew staying any longer would be dangerous, and pointless. But that ridiculous comment about love and poverty was to have unexpected consequences. I didn't see my benefactor from that night again for a whole month. After I left her, the happiness I had felt faded a little more with each passing day. Even the simple fact that she had paid the cafe bill began to weigh on me. I felt as though I had imposed some unbearable obligation on myself. Slowly, she began to seem like just another threatening woman, no different from the landlord's daughter or the teacher's college girl. Even from a distance, Siko constantly intimidated me. Worse still, I was deeply afraid that if I saw again a woman I had once slept with, I might suddenly, without warning, erupt in fury. I've always been timid about meeting people, and so, in the end, I chose the safest course, to keep far away from the Ginza. Here is a cleaned-up and fluent version of the passage, preserving the emotional tone and meaning while enhancing clarity, grammar, and pacing. This timidity of mine was not an act. Women, it seems, possess a remarkable ability to completely separate what happens at night from what happens the next morning. They carry on as if some total oblivion has intervened, living in two unconnected worlds. I, however, had not yet learned how to navigate this strange phenomenon. At the end of November, I went drinking with Hariki at a cheap bar in Kanda. As soon as we stumbled out, my wretched companion insisted we continued drinking elsewhere. We had already run out of money, but he pestered me relentlessly. Finally, and only because I was more drunk and reckless than usual, I said, "All right. I'll take you to the land of dreams. Don't be surprised by what you see. Wine, women, and song." "You mean a cafe?" "I do. Let's go." And that was that. We boarded a streetcar. In high spirits, Hariki said, "I'm starving for a woman tonight. Is it okay if I kiss the hostess?" I never liked Hariki when he acted like that, and he knew it, so he exaggerated his vulgarity even more. "All right. I'm going to kiss her. Whichever hostess sits next to me, I'm kissing her. Okay? It won't make any difference, I suppose. Thanks. I'm really starved for a woman." We got off at the Ginza and walked into the cafe of wine, women, and song. I had virtually no money on me. My only hope was Tsuniko. We sat down across from each other in a booth. Tsuniko and another hostess came over right away. The other girls sat beside me. Tsuniko plopped down next to Hariki. I was startled. Tsuniko was about to be kissed in front of me by Hariki. It wasn't jealousy. I've never had a strong desire to possess anything or anyone. Sometimes, vaguely, I might feel a twinge of regret at losing something, but never enough to assert ownership or argue over it. So detached was I in this regard that, years later, I even watched in silence while my own wife was violated. I have always feared being pulled into the tangled mess of human relationships, the bottomless whirlpool of their emotions and demands. Tsuniko and I had been lovers for only one night. She didn't belong to me. I didn't pretend to feel regret, let alone love. And yet I was shocked, not because I had lost her, but because I pitied her. It pained me that she would have to endure Hariki's crude advances while I watched. Once defiled by him, she would likely leave me. But I didn't love her enough to stop it. I felt a brief shock at her misfortune and thought, it's all over now. Then I simply gave in, helplessly. I looked at Hariki, then at Tsuniko, and forced a grin. But things took a different turn, one far worse. "I've had enough," Hariki said, scowling. "Not even a lecher like me can kiss a woman who looks that poverty-stricken." He folded his arms and stared at Tsuniko with contempt. Then he smirked. "Some liquor?" "I haven't got any money," I whispered to Tsuniko. I needed to drink until I drowned in it. So in the eyes of the world, Tsuniko wasn't even worthy of a drunk's kiss. A pitiful, poverty-ridden woman. And yet, the realization struck me like lightning. That night, I drank more than I ever had. My vision swam. Each time Tsuniko and I met each other's gaze, we exchanged small, broken smiles. Yes, just as Hariki said, she was nothing more than a tired, impoverished woman. But that very thought stirred in me a sense of kinship, comradeship between fellow sufferers. The contrast between rich and poor may be a cliché theme, but I now believe it's one of life's great dramas. I pitied Tsuniko. And for the first time in my life, I felt a real, though faint, movement of love in my heart. Then I vomited. Then I passed out. It was also the first time in my life I drank so much I lost consciousness. When I awoke, Tsuniko was sitting by my pillow, I had been brought to her room on the second floor of the carpenter's house. "I thought you were joking," she said, "when you told me love flies out the window when poverty comes in the door. But you never came back. What a complicated thing love and poverty is. Suppose I work for you, wouldn't that be all right?" "No," I said. "It wouldn't." She lay down beside me. Toward dawn, she said the word death for the first time. She seemed exhausted, completely drained by the simple act of being human. And as I reflected on my own dread of the world, money, the movement, women, school, it seemed impossible that I could go on living. I consented easily to her proposal. And yet, even then, I wasn't entirely convinced. There remained in me a trace of make-believe. The plan didn't yet feel entirely real. We spent the morning wandering around Asakusa. We went into a lunch stand and ordered 2 glasses of milk. She said, "You pay this time." I stood up, took out my wallet, and opened it. 3 copper coins. What struck me was not shame, but horror. My mind immediately flashed to my empty room at the lodging house, bare except for my school uniform and bedding. Not a single thing left to pawn. The only possessions I had were the kimono and coat I was wearing. These were the facts. I realized with utter clarity, I could not go on living. As I stood there in silence, she leaned over and looked inside my wallet. "Is that all you have?" Her voice was innocent, but it cut deep. It was a wound only the voice of the first woman I ever loved could inflict. "Is that all?" Even that overstated things. 3 copper coins don't count as money. It was a humiliation unlike any I had known. A humiliation I couldn't live with. I had not yet outgrown my identity as a rich man's son. That was the moment I truly resolved, without any illusion or doubt, to end my life. That night, we threw ourselves into the sea at Kamakura. She untied her sash, saying she had borrowed it from a friend at the cafe, and left it neatly folded on a rock. I took off my coat and placed it beside hers. Together, we entered the water. She died. I survived. The incident received quite a bit of attention in the press, no doubt because I was a college student, and my father's name added to the drama. I was confined to a coastal hospital. A relative came to handle the arrangements. Before leaving, he warned me that my father and the rest of the family were furious, and that I might be disowned. None of that concerned me. I thought only of the dead Siko. I missed her, and I wept. Of everyone I've known, that wretched Siko was the only one I truly loved. A long letter came from the girl at my lodging house. It was made up of 50 stanzas. Every stanza began with the same unbelievable line. "Please live on for me." The nurses often came into my room, laughing cheerfully. Some would squeeze my hand when they left. They discovered at the hospital that my left lung was affected. This turned out to be most fortunate, when, not long after, I was taken from the hospital to the police station, charged with being an accomplice to a suicide. I was treated not as a criminal, but as a sick man, and was placed in a special custody room rather than a cell. Late that night, the old policeman on night duty in the room next to mine quietly opened the door. "Hey," he called. "You must be cold. Come here, next to the fire." I stepped into his room, sat on a chair, and warmed myself by the fire, wearing an air of deep dejection. "You miss her, don't you?" "Yes," I replied faintly, my voice distant and small. "That's human nature, I guess." His manner grew increasingly self-important. "Where was it you first met this woman?" The question came with the heavy tone of judgment, as though he were a judge. This jailer, clearly looking down on me as a naive child, acted as if he had been formally entrusted with the investigation. No doubt, he secretly hoped to while away the long autumn night by extracting from me a confession with lurid details. I recognized his intent instantly, and had to suppress the urge to burst out laughing. I knew I had the right to refuse any questions in such an informal interrogation, but I decided to entertain him. I cloaked myself in the appearance of simple, sincere belief, pretending I thought he truly held authority over my fate, and made up a confession, absurd enough to satisfy his prurient curiosity. I've got a pretty good idea now. We always take it into account when a prisoner's honest. Thank you very much. I hope you'll help me. It was a masterful performance, nearly inspired. Yet, it brought me no benefit. The next morning, I was called in for the real examination, before the police chief. As soon as I stepped into his office, he said, "There's a handsome lad for you. It wasn't your fault, I can tell. Your mother's to blame for bringing such a good-looking boy into the world." He was still young, dark-complexioned, with the bearing of a university graduate. His words caught me off guard and left me feeling as if I'd been born deformed, with, say, a red macula across half my face. The police chief's questioning was brief and direct, entirely unlike the old policeman's crude and tenacious probing the night before. After he finished, he filled out a form to send to the district attorney. As he wrote, he commented, "You shouldn't neglect your health like that. You've been coughing blood, haven't you?" That morning, I'd had a hacking cough, and each time I coughed, I covered my mouth with my handkerchief, stained with blood. But the blood wasn't from my throat. The night before, I'd been picking at a pimple under my ear. The blood came from that. Still, realizing the advantage of maintaining the illusion, I lowered my eyes and murmured piously, "Yes." The police chief completed the form. "It's up to the district attorney now whether charges are brought. But it would be a good idea to call or telegraph someone who can guarantee you post-bail. There must be someone." I remembered a man from my hometown, an antique dealer who often visited my father's house in Tokyo. He'd served as my guarantor at school. He was a short, stocky bachelor around 40, a loyal lackey of my father's. His face, especially around the eyes, looked like a flatfish. My father always called him Flatfish. I had too. I borrowed the telephone directory and found his number. I called and asked if he would come to Yokohama. He answered in a voice so officious it was almost unrecognizable, but in the end, he agreed to be my guarantor. I returned to the custody room. As I sat, I heard the police chief shouting, "Hey! Someone disinfect the telephone receiver. He's been coughing blood, you know." That afternoon, they tied me up with a thin hemp rope. I was allowed to conceal it under my coat when we went outside, but the young policeman gripped the end tightly. We rode the streetcar to Yokohama. The experience didn't upset me in the least. I even missed the custody room and the old policeman. What is it, I wonder, that makes me that way? Being bound like a criminal actually brought a strange relief, an odd sense of calm. Even now, as I write about it, I feel a kind of expansive, almost pleasant nostalgia. But among those memories is one harrowing disaster I'll never forget, one that still makes me break into a cold sweat. The district attorney's office was dimly lit. The prosecutor was a man of about 40, with an intelligent calm, and what I might call honest good looks, in contrast to my own so-called good looks, which, even if they existed, were tainted with something lewd. He seemed so simple and sincere that I let my guard down completely. I recounted my story with indifference. Then I began coughing again. I pulled out my handkerchief and noticed the old blood stains. Seeing a chance, I exaggerated the coughs, covering my mouth, then glanced at the district attorney's face. With a quiet smile, he asked, "Was that real?" Even now, the memory of that moment fills me with embarrassment. It was worse than when Teichi, back in school, tapped me on the back and said, "You did it on purpose," plunging me into despair. Those two incidents were the greatest disasters in my life of acting. Sometimes I think I would have preferred being sentenced to 10 years in prison rather than suffer the gentle, knowing contempt in that district attorney's smile. The charge was eventually dropped. But it brought me no joy. I sat in the hallway outside the district attorney's office, waiting for my guarantor, Flatfish. The evening sky was glowing through the tall windows behind me. Seagulls flew past in a line that somehow suggested the curve of a woman's body. The Third Notebook, Part 1. One of Teichi's predictions came true, the other failed. The shameful one, that women would fall for me, proved accurate. The hopeful one, that I'd become a great artist, did not. I never amounted to more than a second-rate cartoonist for the cheapest magazines. I was expelled from college because of the Kamakura incident, and I went to live in a tiny room on the second floor of Flatfish's house. I gathered that small sums of money were being sent from home each month for my support, not directly to me, but secretly to Flatfish. Apparently, they were sent by my brothers without my father's knowledge. That was all. Every other connection with my family had been severed. Flatfish was invariably in a bad mood. Even if I smiled to appear agreeable, he never returned the gesture. The change in him was so drastic, it made me reflect on how contemptible, or perhaps how comical, people can be, transforming themselves as easily and thoughtlessly as turning over a hand. Flatfish seemed to be watching me, as though he expected I might commit suicide, perhaps fearing I would throw myself into the sea after the woman. He sternly forbade me from leaving the house. Unable to drink or smoke, I spent my days confined to that cubicle of a room, from the moment I woke until I went to bed, with nothing to do but flip through old magazines. I was living like a half-wit, and had lost even the will to think about dying. Flatfish's house was near the Okubo Medical School. His shop's sign, reading, "Garden of the Green Dragon, Art and Antiques," in bold letters, was the only impressive thing about the place. The shop itself was long and narrow, filled with shelf after shelf of dusty junk. Needless to say, Flatfish didn't make a living by selling this rubbish. He earned money by acting as an intermediary in the transfer of secret property between clients, to avoid taxes. Flatfish was rarely in the shop. He usually left early each morning in a hurry, scowling, leaving a 17-year-old boy in charge. When the boy had nothing better to do, he'd play catch in the street with neighborhood kids. He seemed to think the second-floor parasite, that is, me, was either an idiot or insane. He even lectured me, speaking in the tone of an elder full of superior wisdom. Never having been able to argue with anyone, I just listened silently, with a weary yet admiring expression on my face. I vaguely recall hearing gossip from people at home that the boy might be Flatfish's illegitimate son, though they never addressed each other as father and son. There must have been some reason for this, and for Flatfish remaining a bachelor, but I am congenitally incapable of taking much interest in other people. I don't know anything more than that. Still, there was something fish-like in the boy's eyes, and I often wondered if the rumor might be true. If so, they made a grim father-son pair. Sometimes late at night, they would order noodles from a neighborhood shop, just for themselves, never inviting me, and eat in silence, not exchanging a word. The boy almost always prepared the food and delivered it to me 3 times a day on a separate tray. He and Flatfish ate quickly in the dank little room beneath the stairs, so quickly I could hear the clatter of their plates. One evening toward the end of March, Flatfish, perhaps spurred by an unexpected financial success, or by some other motive I'll never understand, even if both hypotheses were true, there were likely other obscure reasons behind it, invited me downstairs for dinner, accompanied by the rare treat of sake. The host seemed impressed with the unusual delicacy of sliced tuna and, in a surprisingly generous moment, offered a little sake even to his listless hanger-on. He asked, "What do you plan to do, in the future, I mean?" I didn't answer. Instead, I picked up some dried sardines with my chopsticks and examined their silvery eyes. I felt the faint flush of intoxication rising in me. Suddenly I was nostalgic, for the days I'd drifted from bar to bar drinking, even for Hariki. A desperate longing for freedom overtook me, and I became weak, tearful. Since arriving at Flatfish's house, I had lacked even the energy to play the clown. I lay flattened under the contemptuous glances of Flatfish and the boy. Flatfish, for his part, seemed disinclined to talk at length, and I felt no urge to chase him down with complaints. Still, he continued, "As things stand, your suspended sentence won't count as a criminal record or anything like that. So, you see, your rehabilitation depends entirely on you. If you mend your ways and bring your problems to me, seriously, I mean, I'll certainly do what I can to help." His way of speaking, no, not just his, but everyone's, was riddled with strange, elusive complexities, always layered with irritating vagueness. I've never understood the purpose of such overcautious evasiveness. In the end, I usually stopped caring, either laughing it off with clownishness, or nodding in silent, defeated submission. Years later, I came to realize that if Flatfish had simply stated the facts, things might have turned out differently. But because of his needless caution, or, more accurately, the incomprehensible vanity and obsession with appearances that afflict all people, I ended up enduring a series of dismal experiences. How much better it would have been if Flatfish had said something like, "I'd like you to enroll in school starting in April. Your family has agreed to send you a proper allowance once you're admitted." I didn't learn until later that this was, in fact, the situation. Had I known then, I probably would have done what he asked. But because of his intolerably vague and roundabout way of speaking, all I felt was irritation, and that irritation would change the course of my life. "If you don't feel like sharing your problems with me," he said, "then I'm afraid there's nothing I can do." What kind of problems? I honestly had no idea what he was getting at. Isn't there something weighing on your heart? For example? For example, what do you want to do now? Do you think I should get a job? No, don't ask me. Tell me what you really want. But suppose I said I wanted to go back to school. Yes, I know. It costs money. But the issue isn't money, it's what you feel. Why, I wonder, couldn't he have just mentioned that money would be sent from home? That one simple fact could have settled everything. Instead, I was left lost in a fog. Here's a cleaned up and polished version of the passage. It preserves the tone, emotion, and character dynamics while improving clarity, grammar, and structure. How about it? Do you have anything that might be described as aspirations for the future? I suppose one can't expect people they help to truly understand how difficult it is to help another person. I'm sorry. I'm really worried about you. I'm responsible for you now, and I don't like seeing you with such half-hearted feelings. I wish you'd show me that you're committed to turning over a new leaf. If, for example, you were to come to me and seriously discuss your plans for the future, I'd certainly do what I could to support you. But of course, don't expect to continue your former life of luxury on what poor old Flatfish can offer. Don't delude yourself on that score. Still, if you're truly determined to begin again and you make clear, concrete plans to rebuild your future, I might be willing to help you rehabilitate yourself. That's if you come to me for help, though heaven knows I don't have much to spare. Do you understand how I feel? What are your plans? If you won't let me stay here in your house, I'll work. Are you serious? Do you realize that these days even graduates from Tokyo Imperial University? No, I wasn't thinking of joining a company. What then? I want to be a painter. I said this with conviction. What? I can never forget the indescribably crafty shadow that passed over Flatfish's face as he laughed, his neck drawing in. It resembled contempt, yet it wasn't quite that. If the world were an ocean with depths of 1,000 fathoms, that shadow was the sort of eerie thing you might glimpse hovering at the very bottom. It was a laugh that gave me a sudden, vivid glimpse into the utter nadir of adult life. Let me know if you'd like help continuing or compiling everything into one complete, edited chapter. He said, "There's no point in discussing such a thing. Your feelings are still all up in the air. Think it over. Please devote this evening to thinking it over seriously." I ran up to the second floor as though driven, but even when I lay in bed nothing of a particularly constructive nature occurred to me. The next morning at dawn I ran away from Flatfish's house. I left behind a note, scrawled in pencil in big letters on my writing pad. I shall return tonight without fail. I am going to discuss my plans for the future with a friend who lives at the address below. Please don't worry about me. I'm telling the truth. I wrote Hariki's name and address, and stole out of Flatfish's house. I did not run away because I was mortified at having been lectured by Flatfish. I was, exactly as Flatfish described, a man whose feelings were up in the air, and I had absolutely no idea about future plans or anything else. Besides, I felt rather sorry for Flatfish that I should be a burden on him, and I found it quite intolerably painful to think that if by some remote chance I felt like bestirring myself to achieve a worthy purpose, I should have to depend on poor old Flatfish to dole out each month the capital needed for my rehabilitation. When I left Flatfish's house, however, I was certainly not seriously entertaining any idea of consulting the likes of Hariki about my future plans. I left the note hoping thereby to pacify Flatfish for a little while, if only for a split second. I didn't write the note so much out of a detective story stratagem to gain a little more time for my escape, though I must admit that the desire was at least faintly present, as to avoid causing Flatfish a sudden shock which would send him into a state of wild alarm and confusion. I think that might be a somewhat more accurate presentation of my motives. I knew that the facts were certain to be discovered, but I was afraid to state them as they were. One of my tragic flaws is the compulsion to add some sort of embellishment to every situation, a quality which has made people call me at times a liar. But I have almost never embellished in order to bring myself any advantage. It was rather that I had a strangulating fear of that cataclysmic change in the atmosphere the instant the flow of a conversation flagged. And even when I knew that it would later turn to my disadvantage, I frequently felt obliged to add, almost inadvertently, my word of embellishment, out of a desire to please born of my usual desperate mania for service. This may have been a twisted form of my weakness and idiocy, but the habit it engendered was taken full advantage of by the so-called honest citizens of the world. That was how I happened to jot down Hariki's name and address as they floated up from the distant recesses of my memory. After leaving Flatfish's house, I walked as far as Shinjuku, where I sold the books I had in my pockets. Then I stood there uncertainly, utterly at a loss what to do. Though I have always made it my practice to be pleasant to everybody, I have not once actually experienced friendship. I have only the most painful recollections of my various acquaintances, with the exception of such companions in pleasure as Hariki. I have frantically played the clown in order to disentangle myself from these painful relationships, only to wear myself out as a result. Even now it comes as a shock if by chance I notice in the street a face resembling someone I know, however slightly, and I am at once seized by a shivering, violent enough to make me dizzy. I know that I am liked by other people, but I seem to be deficient in the faculty to love others. I should add that I have very strong doubts as to whether even human beings really possess this faculty. It was hardly to be expected that someone like myself could ever develop any close friendships. Besides, I lacked even the ability to pay visits. The front door of another person's house terrified me more than the gate of Inferno in the Divine Comedy, and I am not exaggerating when I say that I really felt I could detect within the door the presence of a horrible dragon-like monster writhing there with a dank, raw smell. I had no friends. I had nowhere to go. Hariki. Here was a real case of a true word having been said in jest. I decided to visit Hariki, exactly as I had stated in my farewell note to Flatfish. I had never before gone myself to Hariki's house. Usually I would invite him to my place by telegram when I wanted to see him. Now, however, I doubted whether I could manage the telegraph fee. I also wondered, with the jaundiced intelligence of a man in disgrace, whether Hariki might not refuse to come even if I telegraphed him. I decided on a visit, the most difficult thing in the world for me. Giving vent to a sigh, I boarded the streetcar. The thought that the only hope left me in the world was Hariki filled me with a foreboding dreadful enough to send chills up and down my spine. Hariki was at home. He lived in a 2-storied house at the end of a dirty alley. Hariki occupied only one medium-sized room on the 2nd floor. Downstairs his parents and a young workman were busily stitching and pounding strips of cloth to make thongs for sandals. Hariki showed me that day a new aspect of his city-dweller personality. This was his knowing nature, an egoism so icy, so crafty that a country boy like myself could only stare with eyes open wide in amazement. He was not a simple, endlessly passive type like myself. You. What a surprise. You've been forgiven by your father, have you? Not yet? I was unable to confess that I had run away. In my usual way I evaded the issue, though I was certain that Hariki soon, if not immediately, would grasp what had happened. Things will take care of themselves, in one way or another. Look here. It's no laughing matter. Let me give you a word of advice. Stop your foolishness here and now. I've got business today anyway. I'm awfully busy these days. Business? What kind of business? Hey, what are you doing there? Don't tear the thread off the cushion. While we were talking, I had unconsciously been fiddling with and twisting around my finger one of the tassel-like threads which protruded from the corners of the cushion on which I sat. Binding threads, I think they are called. Hariki had assumed a jealous possessiveness about everything in his house down to the last cushion thread, and he glared at me, seemingly quite unembarrassed by this attitude. When I think of it, Hariki's acquaintanceship with me had cost him nothing. Hariki's aged mother brought in a tray with 2 dishes of jelly. What have we here? Hariki asked his mother tenderly, in the tones of the truly dutiful son, continuing in language so polite it sounded quite unnatural. Oh, I'm sorry. Have you made jelly? That's terrific. You shouldn't have bothered. I was just going out on some business. But it would be wicked not to eat your wonderful jelly after you've gone to all the trouble. Thank you so much. Then, turning in my direction. How about one for you? Mother made it specially. Ah, this is delicious. Really terrific. He ate with a gusto, almost a rapture, which did not seem to be altogether play acting. I also spooned my bowl of jelly. It tasted watery asterisk, and when I came to the piece of fruit at the bottom, it was not fruit after all, but a substance I could not identify. I by no means despised their poverty. At the time I didn't think that the jelly tasted bad, and I was really grateful for the old woman's kindness. It is true that I dread poverty, but I do not believe I ever have despised it. The jelly and the way Hariki rejoiced over it taught me a lesson in the parsimoniousness of the city dweller, and in what it is really like in a Tokyo household where the members divide their lives so sharply between what they do at home and what they do on the outside. I was filled with dismay at these signs that I, a fool rendered incapable by my perpetual flight from human society from distinguishing between, at home, and, on the outside, was the only one completely left out, that I had been deserted even by Hariki. I should like to record that as I manipulated the peeling lacquer chopsticks to eat my jelly, I felt unbearably lonely. I'm sorry, but I've got an appointment today, Hariki said, standing and putting on his jacket. I'm going now. Sorry. At that moment a woman visitor arrived for Hariki. My fortunes thereby took a sudden turn. Hariki at once became quite animated. Oh, I am sorry. I was just on my way to your place when this fellow dropped in without warning. No, you're not in the way at all. Please come in. He seemed rattled. I took the cushion from under me and turned it over before handing it to Hariki, but snatching it from my hands he turned it over once more as he offered it to the woman. There was only that one cushion for guests, besides the cushion Hariki sat on. The woman was a tall, thin person. She declined the cushion and sat demurely in a corner by the door. I listened absent-mindedly to their conversation. The woman, evidently an employee of a magazine publisher, had commissioned an illustration from Hariki, and had come now to collect it. We're in a terrible hurry, she explained. It's ready. It's been ready for some time. Here you are. A messenger arrived with a telegram. As Hariki read it, I could see the good spirits on his face turn ugly. Damn it, what have you been up to? The telegram was from Flatfish. You go back at once. I ought to take you there myself, I suppose, but I haven't got the time now. Imagine, a runaway, and looking so smug, the woman asked. Where do you live? In Okubo, I answered without thinking. That's quite near my office. She was born in Koshu and was 28. She lived in an apartment in Kokenji with her 5-year-old girl. She told me that her husband had died 3 years before. You look like someone who's had an unhappy childhood. You're so sensitive, more's the pity for you. I led for the first time the life of a kept man. After Shizuko, that was the name of the lady journalist, went out to work in the morning at the magazine publishers, her daughter Shigeko and I obediently looked after the apartment. Shigeko had always been left to play in the superintendent's room while her mother was away, and now she seemed delighted that an interesting uncle had turned up as a new playmate. For about a week I remained in a state of daze. Just outside the apartment window was a kite caught in the telegraph wires. Blown about and ripped by the dusty spring wind, it nevertheless clung tenaciously to the wires, as if in affirmation of something. Every time I looked at the kite I had to smile with embarrassment and blush. It haunted me even in dreams. "I want some money." "How much?" she asked. "A lot. Love flies out the window when poverty comes in the door," they say, and it's true. Don't be silly. Such a trite expression. Is it? But you don't understand. I may run away if things go on at this rate. Which of us is the poor one? And which will run away? What a silly thing to say. I want to buy my drinks and cigarettes with my own money. I'm a lot better artist than Hariki. At such times the self-portraits I painted in high school, the ones Teichi called ghost pictures, naturally came to mind. My lost masterpieces? These, my only really worthwhile pictures, had disappeared during one of my frequent changes of address. I afterwards painted pictures of every description, but they all fell far, far short of those splendid works as I remembered them. I was plagued by a heavy sense of loss, as if my heart had become empty. The undrunk glass of absinthe. A sense of loss which was doomed to remain eternally unmitigated stealthily began to take shape. Whenever I spoke of painting, that undrunk glass of absinthe nickered before my eyes. I was agonized by the frustrating thought, if only I could show them those paintings they would believe in my artistic talents. Do you really? You're adorable when you joke. That way with a serious face. But it was no joke. It was true. I wished I could have shown her those pictures. I felt an empty chagrin which suddenly gave way to resignation. I added, "Cartoons, I mean. I'm sure I'm better than Hariki at cartoons if nothing else." These clownish words of deceit were taken more seriously than the truth. "Yes, that's so. I've really been struck by those cartoons you're always drawing for Shigeko. I've burst out laughing over them myself. How would you like to draw for our magazine? I can easily ask the editor." Her company published a monthly magazine, not an especially notable one, for children. Most women have only to lay eyes on you to want to be doing something for you so badly they can't stand it. You're always so timid and yet you're funny. Sometimes you get terribly lonesome and depressed, but that only makes a woman's heart itch all the more for you. Shizuko flattered me with these and other comments which, with the special repulsive quality of the kept man, I calmly accepted. Whenever I thought of my situation I sank all the deeper in my depression, and I lost all my energy. It kept preying on my mind that I needed money more than a woman, that anyway I wanted to escape from Shizuko and make my own living. I made plans of every sort, but my struggles only enmeshed me the more in my dependence on her. This strong-minded woman herself dealt with the complications which developed from my running away, and took care of almost everything else for me. As a result I became more timid than ever before her. At Shizuko's suggestion a conference took place, attended by Flatfish, Hariki and herself, at which it was concluded that all relations between me and my family were to be broken, and I was to live with Shizuko as man and wife. Thanks also to Shizuko's efforts, my cartoons began to produce a surprising amount of money. I bought liquor and cigarettes, as I had planned, with the proceeds, but my gloom and depression grew only the more intense. I had sunk to the bottom, sometimes when I was drawing The Adventures of Kinta and Oda, the monthly comic strip for Shizuko's magazine, I would suddenly think of home, and this made me feel so miserable that my pen would stop moving, and I looked down, through brimming tears. At such times the one slight relief is little Shigeko. By now she was calling me with no show of hesitation. "Daddy, is it true that God will grant you anything if you pray for it?" I thought that I for one would like to make such a prayer. "Oh, vouchsafe unto me a will of ice. Acquaint me with the true natures of Human beings. Is it not a sin for a man to push aside his fellow? Vouchsafe unto me a mask of anger. Yes. I'm sure he'll grant Yoshiko anything she wants, but I don't suppose Daddy has a chance. I was frightened even by God. I could not believe in his love, only in his punishment. Faith. That I felt was the act of facing the tribunal of justice with one's head bowed to receive the scourge of God. I could believe in hell, but it was impossible for me to believe in the existence of heaven. Why haven't you a chance? Because I disobeyed what my father told me. Did you? But everybody says you're so nice. That's because I deceived them. I was aware that everybody in the apartment house was friendly to me, but it was extremely difficult for me to explain to Shigeko how much I feared them all, and how I was cursed by the unhappy peculiarity that the more I feared people the more I was liked, and the more I was liked the more I feared them, a process which eventually compelled me to run away from everybody. I casually changed the subject. Shigeko, what would you like from God? I would like my real daddy back. I felt dizzy with the shock. An enemy. Was I Shiko's enemy, or was she mine? Here was another frightening grown-up who would intimidate me. A stranger, an incomprehensible stranger, a stranger full of secrets. Shigeko's face suddenly began to look that way. I had been deluding myself with the belief that Shigeko at least was safe, but she too was like the ox which suddenly lashes out with its tail to kill the horsefly on its flank. I knew that from then on I would have to be timid even before that little girl. Is the lady killer at home? Hariki had taken to visiting me again at my place. I could not refuse him, even though this was the man who had made me so miserable the day I ran away. I welcomed him with a feeble smile. Your comic strips are getting quite a reputation, aren't they? There's no competing with amateurs. They're so foolhardy they don't know when to be afraid. But don't get overconfident. Your composition is still not worth a damn. He dared to act the part of the master to me. I felt my usual empty tremor of anguish at the thought. I can imagine the expression on his face if I showed him my ghost pictures. But I protested instead. Don't say such things. You'll make me cry. Hariki looked all the more elated with himself. If all you've got is just enough talent to get along, sooner or later you'll betray yourself. Just enough talent to get along. I really had to smile at that. Imagine saying that I had enough talent to get along. It occurred to me that a man like myself who dreads human beings, shuns and deceives them, might on the surface seem strikingly like another man who reveres the clever, worldly wise rules for success embodied in the proverb, "Let sleeping dogs lie." Is it not true that no two human beings understand anything whatsoever about each other, that those who consider themselves bosom friends may be utterly mistaken about their fellow, and, failing to realize this sad truth throughout a lifetime, weep when they read in the newspapers about his death? Hariki, I had to admit, participated in the settlement after my running away, though reluctantly, under pressure from Shizuko, and he was now behaving exactly like the great benefactor to whom I owed my rehabilitation, or like the go-between of a romance. The look on his face as he lectured me was grave. Sometimes he would barge in late at night, dead drunk, to sleep at my place, or stop by to borrow 5 yen, invariably 5 yen. You must stop your fooling around with women. You've gone far enough. Society won't stand for more. What, I wondered, did he mean by society? The plural of human beings? Where was the substance of this thing called society? I had spent my whole life thinking that society must certainly be something powerful, harsh and severe, but to hear Hariki talk made the words, "Don't you mean your self?" come to the tip of my tongue. But I held the words back, reluctant to anger him. Society won't stand for it. It's not society. You're the one who won't stand for it, right? If you do such a thing, society will make you suffer for it. It's not society. It's you, isn't it? Before you know it, you'll be ostracized by society. It's not society. You're going to do the ostracizing, aren't you? Words of every kind went flitting through my head. Know thy particular fearsomeness, thy knavery, cunning and witchcraft. What I said, however, as I wiped the perspiration from my face with a handkerchief was merely, "You've put me in a cold sweat." I smiled. From then on, however, I came to hold, almost as a philosophical conviction, the belief, what is society but an individual? From the moment I suspected that society might be an individual, I was able to act more in accordance with my own inclinations. Shizuko found that I had become rather self-willed and not so timid as before. Hariki remarked that it was funny how stingy I had become. Or, as Shigeko had it, I had stopped being so nice to Shigeko. Without a word, without a trace of a smile, I spent one day after the next looking after Shigeko and drawing comic strips, some of them so idiotic I couldn't understand them myself, for the various firms which commissioned them. Orders had gradually started coming in from other publishers, all of an even lower class than Shizuko's company, third-rate publishers, I suppose they'd be called. I drew with excessively depressed emotions, deliberately penning each line, only to earn money for drink. When Shizuko came home from work, I would dash out as if in relay with her, and head for the outdoor booths near the station to drink cheap, strong liquor. Somewhat buoyed after a bout, I would return to the apartment. I would say, "The more I look at you, the funnier your face seems. Do you know I get inspiration for my cartoons from looking at your face when you're asleep? What about your face when you sleep? You look like an old man, a man of 40. It's all your fault. You've drained me dry. Man's life is like a flowing river. What is there to fret over? On the river bank a willow tree. Hurry to bed and stop making such a racket. Would you like something to eat?" She was quite calm. She did not take me seriously. "If there's any liquor left, I'll drink it. Man's life is like a flowing river. Man's river. No, I mean the river flows, the flowing life." I would go on singing as Shizuko took off my clothes. I fell asleep with my forehead pressed against her breast. This was my daily routine. Et puis on recommence encore le lendemain. Avec settlement la même rage que la veille. Et que est dia vida les grandes sois barbares. De même que les grandes douleurs. Comme un crapaud contourne un pierre sur son chemin. When I first read in translation these verses by Guy Charles Cross, I blushed until my face burned. The toad. The toad. That is what I was, a toad. It was not a question of whether or not society tolerated me, whether or not it ostracized me. I was an animal lower than a dog, lower than a cat. A toad. I sluggishly moved, that's all. The quantities of liquor I consumed had gradually increased. I went drinking not only in the neighborhood of the Koenji station but as far as the Shinza. Sometimes I spent the night out. At bars I acted the part of a ruffian, kissed women indiscriminately, did anything as long as it was not in accord with accepted usage, drank as wildly, no more so, as before my attempted suicide, was so hard-pressed for money that I used to pawn Shizuko's clothes. A year had passed since I first came to her apartment, and smiled bitterly at the torn kite. One day, along when the cherry trees were going to leaf, I stole some of Shizuko's underrobes and sashes, and took them to a pawnshop. I used the money they gave me to go drinking on the Ginza. I spent 2 nights in a row away from home. By the evening of the 3rd day I began to feel some compunctions about my behavior, and I returned to Shizuko's apartment. I unconsciously hushed my footsteps as I approached the door, and I could hear Shizuko talking with Siko. "Why does he drink? It's not because he likes liquor. It's because he's too good because... Do all good people drink? Not necessarily, but... I'm sure Dad'll be surprised. Maybe he won't like it. Look. It's jumped out of the box. Like the funny man in the comics he draws. Yes, isn't it?" Shizuko's low laugh sounded genuinely happy. I opened the door a crack and looked in. I saw a small white rabbit bounding around the room. The 2 of them were chasing it. They were happy, the 2 of them. I'd been a fool to come between them. I might destroy them both if I were not careful. A humble happiness. A good mother and child. God, I thought, if you listen to the prayers of people like myself, grant me happiness once. Only once in my whole lifetime will be enough. Hear my prayer. I felt like getting down on my knees to pray then and there. I shut the door boffly, went to the Sinza, and did not return to the apartment. My next spell as a kept man was in an apartment. Over a bar close by the Kyobashi station. Society. I felt as though even I were beginning at last to acquire some vague notion of what it meant. It is the struggle between one. Close to a year had gone by since I took up this debased life in the bar in Kyobashi. My cartoons were no longer confined to the children's magazines, but now appeared also in the cheap, pornographic magazines that are sold in railway stations. Under a silly pseudonym I drew dirty pictures of naked women to which I usually appended appropriate verses from the Rubaiyat. Waste not your hour, nor in the vain pursuit of this and that endeavor and dispute. Better be merry with the fruitful grape than sadden after none, or bitter fruit. Some for the glories of this world, and some sigh for the prophet's paradise to come. Ah, take the cash, and let the promise go. Nor heed the music of a distant drum, and that inverted bowl we call the sky where under crawling cooped we live and die. Lift not your hands to it for help, for it as impotently rolls as you or I. There was at this period in my life a maiden who pleaded with me to give up drink. You can't go on, drinking every day from morning to night that way. She was a girl of 17 or so who worked in a little tobacco shop across the way from the bar. Yoshiko, that was her name, was a pale girl with crooked teeth. Whenever I went to buy cigarettes she would smile and repeat her advice. What's wrong with drinking? Why is it bad? Better be merry with the fruitful grape than sadden after none, or bitter fruit. Many years ago there was a Persian. No, let's skip it. Oh, plague no more will human or divine, tomorrow's tangle to itself resign, and lose your fingers in the tresses of the cypress slender minister of wine. Do you understand? No, I don't. What a stupid little girl you are. I'm going to kiss you. Go ahead. She pouted out her lower lip, not in the least abashed. You silly fool. You and your ideas of chastity. There was something unmistakable in Yoshiko's expression which marked her as a virgin who had never been denied. Soon after New Year, one night in the dead of winter, I drunkenly staggered out in the cold to buy some cigarettes and fell into a manhole in front of her shop. I shouted for Yoshiko to come save me. She hauled me out and bandaged my bruised right arm. Yoshiko, earnest and unsmiling, said, "You drink too much." The thought of dying has never bothered me, but getting hurt, losing blood, becoming crippled and the like, no thanks. I thought as I watched Yoshiko bandage my hand that I might cut down on my drinking. I'm giving it up. From tomorrow on I won't touch a drop. Do you mean it? Live it up. Will you marry me, Yoshiko? Asking her to marry me was, however, intended only as a joke. Natch for naturally was popular at the time. Right. Let's hook fingers on that. I promise I'll give it up. The next day, as might have been expected, I spent drinking. Towards evening I made my way to Yoshiko's shop on shaking legs and called to her. Yoshiko, I'm sorry. I got drunk. Oh, you're awful. Trying to fool me by pretending to be drunk. I was startled. I felt suddenly quite sober. No, it's the truth. I really have been drinking. I'm not pretending. Don't tease me. You're mean. She suspected nothing. I should think you could tell by just looking at me. I've been drinking today since noon. Forgive me. You're a good actor. I'm not acting, you little idiot. I'm going to kiss you. Go ahead. No, I'm not qualified. I'm afraid I'll have to give up the idea of marrying you. Look at my face. Red, isn't it? I've been drinking. It's just the sunset shining on it. Don't try to fool me. You promised yesterday you wouldn't drink. You wouldn't break a promise, would you? We hooked fingers. Don't tell me you've been drinking. It's a lie, I know it is. Yoshiko's pale face was smiling as she sat there inside the dimly lit shop. What a holy thing uncorrupted virginity is, I thought. I had never slept with a virgin, a girl younger than myself. I'd marry her. I wanted once in my lifetime to know that great savage joy, no matter how immense the suffering that might ensue. I had always imagined that the beauty of virginity was nothing more than the sweet, sentimental illusion of stupid poets, but it really is alive and present in this world. We would get married. In the spring we'd go together on bicycles to see waterfalls framed in green leaves. I made up my mind on the spot. It was a then and there decision, and I did not hesitate to steal the flower. Not long afterwards we were married. The joy I obtained as a result of this action was not necessarily great or savage, but the suffering which ensued was staggering, so far surpassing what I had imagined that even describing it as horrendous would not quite cover it. The world, after all, was still a place of bottomless horror. It was by no means a place of childlike simplicity where everything could be settled by a single then and there decision. The Third Notebook, Part 2. Hariki and myself. Despising each other as we did, we were constantly together, thereby degrading ourselves. If that is what the world calls friendship, the relations between Hariki and myself were undoubtedly those of friendship. I threw myself on the chivalry of the madam of the bar in Kyobashi. It is a strange UBC of the word to speak of a woman's chivalry, but in my experience, at least in the cities, the women possessed a greater abundance of what might be termed chivalry than the men. Most men concern themselves, all fear and trembling, only with appearances, and were stingy to boot. She enabled me to marry Yoshiko and to rent a room on the ground floor of an apartment building near the Sumida River which we made our home. I gave up drink and devoted my energies to drawing cartoons. After dinner we would go out together to see a movie, and on the way back we would stop at a milk bar or buy pots of flowers. But more than any of these things it gave me pleasure just to listen to the words or watch the movements of my little bride, who trusted in me with all her heart. Then, just when I had begun to entertain faintly in my breast the sweet notion that perhaps there was a chance I might turn one of these days into a human being and be spared the necessity of a horrible death, Hariki showed up again. He hailed me. "How's the great lover? Why, what's this? Do I detect a note of caution in your face, you of all people? I've come today as a messenger from the Lady of Koenji." He lowered his voice and thrust his jaw in the direction of Yoshiko, who was preparing tea in the kitchen, as much as to ask whether it was all right to continue. I answered nonchalantly. "It doesn't matter. You can say anything before her." As a matter of fact, Yoshiko was what I should like to call a genius at trusting people. She suspected nothing of my relations with the madam of the bar in Kyobashi, and even after I told her all about the incident which occurred at Kamakura, she was equally unsuspicious of my relations with Siko. It was not because I was an accomplished liar. At times I spoke quite bluntly, but Yoshiko seemed to take everything I said as a joke. "You seem to be just as cocksure of yourself as ever. Anyway, it's nothing important. She asked me to tell you to visit her once in a while." Just when I was beginning to forget, that bird of ill omen came flapping my way, to rip open with its beak the wounds of memory. All at once shame over the past and the recollection of Ben unfolded themselves before my eyes, and, seized by a terror so great it made me want to shriek, I could not sit still a moment longer. "How about a drink?" I asked. "Suits me," said Hariki. Hariki and myself. Though outwardly he appeared to be a human being like the rest, I sometimes felt he was exactly like myself. Of course that was only after we had been making the round of the bars, drinking cheap liquor here and there. When the two of us met face to face it was as if we immediately metamorphosed into dogs of the same shape and pelt, and we bounded out through the streets covered with fallen snow. That was how we happened to warm over, as it were, the embers of our old friendship. We went together to the bar in Kyobaspi and eventually, we two souse dogs visited Spazuko's apartment in Koenji, where I sometimes spent the night. I shall never forget. It was a sticky hot summer's night. Hariki had come to my apartment about dusk, wearing a tattered summer kimono. He told me that an emergency had come up and he had been obliged to pawn his summer suit. He asked me to lend him some money because he was anxious to redeem the suit before his aged mother found out. The matter apparently concerned him genuinely. As ill luck would have it, I hadn't any money at my place. As usual, I sent Yoshiko out to the pawnshop with some of her clothes. I lent Hariki what he needed from the money she received, but there was still a little left over, and I asked Yoshiko to buy some gin with it. We went up on the roof of the apartment house, where we celebrated the evening cool with a dismal little party. Faint miasmic gusts of wind blew in from the river. Every now and then, we began a guessing game of tragic and comic nouns. This game, which I myself had invented, was based on the proposition that just as nouns could be divided into masculine, feminine, and neuter, so there was a distinction between tragic and comic nouns. For example, this system decreed that steamship and steam engine were both tragic nouns, while streetcar and bus were comic. Persons who failed to see why this was true were obviously unqualified to discuss art. And a playwright who included even a single tragic noun in a comedy showed himself a failure if for no other reason. The same held equally true of comic nouns and tragedies. I began the questioning. Are you ready? What is tobacco? Tragic, Hariki answered promptly. What about medicine? Powder or pills? Injection. Tragic. I wonder. Don't forget, there are hormone injections too. No, there's no question, but it's tragic. First of all, there's a needle. What could be more tragic than a needle? You win. But you know, medicines and doctors are, surprisingly enough, comic. What about death? Comic. And that goes for Christian ministers and Buddhist priests too. Bravo! Then life must be tragic? Wrong. It's comic too. In that case, everything becomes comic. Here's one more for you. What about cartoonist? You couldn't possibly call it a comic noun, could you? Tragic. An extremely tragic noun. What do you mean? Extremely tragic is a good description of you. Any game which can drop to the level of such abysmal jokes is despicable, but we were very proud of what we considered to be an extremely witty diversion, never before known in the salons of the world. I had invented one other game of a rather similar character, a guessing game of antonyms. The antonym of black is white, but the antonym of white is red. The antonym of red is black. I asked now, what's the antonym of flower? Hariki frowned in thought. Let me section. There used to be a restaurant called the Flower Moon. It must be moon. That's not an antonym. It's more of a synonym. Aren't star and garter synonymous? It's not an antonym. I've got it. It's bee. Bee? Aren't there bees, or is it ants, in peonies? What are you trying to do? No bluffing now. I know! Clustering clouds that cover the flowers. You must be thinking of clouds that cover the moon. That's right. Wind that destroys the blossoms. It's the wind. The antonym of flower is wind. Pretty poor. Sounds like a line out of a popular song. You betray your origins. Well then, how about something more recondite, say a mandolin? Still no good. The antonym of flower. You're supposed to name the thing in the world which is least like a flower. That's what I'm trying to do. Wait. How about this, a woman? Then what's a synonym for woman? Entrails. You're not very poetic, are you? Well then, what's the antonym for entrails? Milk. That's pretty good. One more in that vein. Shame. What's the antonym of shame? Shameless. A popular cartoonist I could name. What about Masao Hariki? By the time we reached this point, we had gradually become incapable of laughter, and were beginning to experience the particular oppressiveness as if one's head were stuffed with broken glass. That comes from getting drunk on gin. Don't be cheeky now. I for one have never been tied up like a common criminal the way you have. I was taken aback. Hariki at heart did not treat me like a full human being. He could only consider me as the living corpse of a would-be suicide, a person dead to shame, an idiot ghost. His friendship had no other purpose but to utilize me in whichever way would most further his own pleasures. This thought naturally did not make me very happy, but I realized, after a moment, that it was entirely to be expected that Hariki should take this view of me, that from long ago, even as a child, I seemed to lack the qualifications of a human being, and that, for all I know, contempt, even from Hariki, might be entirely merited. I said, feigning tranquility. Crime. What's the antonym of crime? This is a hard one. The law, of course, Hariki answered flatly. I looked at his face again. Caught in the flashing red light of a neon sign on a nearby building, Hariki's face had the somber dignity of the relentless prosecutor. I felt shaken to the core. Crime belongs in a different category. Imagine saying that the law was the antonym of crime. But perhaps everybody in society can go on living in self-satisfaction, thanks to just such simple concepts. They think that crime hatches where there are no policemen. Well, in that case, what would it be? God? That would suit you. There's something about you that smells a little of a Christian priest. I find it offensive. Let's not dispose of the problem so lightly. Let's think about it a bit more together. Isn't it an interesting theme? I feel you can tell everything about a man just from his answer to this one question. You can't be serious. The antonym of crime is virtue. A virtuous citizen. In short, someone like myself. Let's not joke. Virtue is the antonym of vice, not of crime. Are vice and crime different? They are, I think. Virtue and vice are concepts invented by human beings, words for a morality which human beings arbitrarily devised. What a nuisance. Well, I suppose it is God in that case. God. God. You can't go wrong if you leave everything at God. I'm hungry. Yoshiko is cooking some beans downstairs now. Thanks. I like beans. He lay down on the floor, his hands tucked under his head. I said, You don't seem to be very interested in crime. That's right. I'm not a criminal like you. I may indulge myself with a little dissipation, but I don't cause women to die, and I don't lift money from them either. The voice of a resistance weak but desperate spoke from somewhere in my heart. It said that I had not caused anyone to die, that I had not lifted money from anyone, but once again the ingrained habit of considering myself evil took command. It is quite impossible for me to contradict anyone to his face. I struggled with all my might to control the feelings which mounted more dangerously in me with each instant, the result of the depressing effects of the gin. Finally I muttered almost to myself, Actions punishable by jail sentences are not the only crimes. If we knew the antonym of crime, I think we would know its true nature. God, salvation, love, light. But for God there is the antonym. Satan, for salvation there is perdition, for love there is hate, for light there is darkness, for good, evil. Crime and prayer? Crime and repentance? Crime and confession? Crime and... No, they're all synonymous. What is the opposite of crime? Well, if you spell crime backwards, no, that doesn't make sense. But the word does contain the letters RIC, rice. I'm hungry. Bring me something to eat. Why don't you go get it yourself? My voice shook with a rage I had almost never before betrayed. All right. I'll go downstairs, then Yoshiko and I will commit a crime together. Personal demonstration is better than empty debates. The antonym of crime is rice. No, it's beans. He was so drunk he could barely articulate the words. Do as you please. Only get the hell out of here. He got up mumbling incoherently. Crime and an empty stomach. Empty stomach and beans. No. Those are synonyms. Crime and punishment. Dostoevsky. These words grazed over a corner of my mind, startling me. Just supposing Dostoevsky ranged crime and punishment side by side not as synonyms but as antonyms. Crime and punishment. Absolutely incompatible ideas, irreconcilable as oil and water. I felt I was beginning to understand what lay at the bottom of the scum-covered, turbid pond, that chaos of Dostoevsky's mind. No, I still didn't quite see. Such thoughts were flashing through my head like a revolving lantern when I heard a voice. Extraordinary beans you've got here. Come have a look. Hariki's voice and color had changed. Just a minute before he had staggered off downstairs, and here he was back again, before I knew it. What is it? A strange excitement ran through me. The two of us went down from the roof to the second floor and were halfway down the stairs to my room on the ground floor when Hariki stopped me and whispered. Look! He pointed. A small window opened over my room, through which I could see the interior. The light was lit and 2 animals were visible. My eyes swam, but I murmured to myself through my violent breathing. This is just another aspect of the behavior of human beings. There's nothing to be surprised at. I stood petrified on the staircase, not even thinking to help Yoshiko. Hariki noisily cleared his throat. I ran back up to the roof to escape and collapsed there. The feelings which assailed me as I looked up at the summer night sky heavy with rain were not of fury or hatred, nor even of sadness. They were of overpowering fear, not the terror the sight of ghosts in a graveyard might arouse, but rather a fierce ancestral dread that could not be expressed in 4 or 5 words, something perhaps like encountering in the sacred grove of a Shinto shrine the white-clothed body of the god. My hair turned prematurely gray from that night. I had now lost all confidence in myself, doubted all men immeasurably, and abandoned all hopes for the things of this world, all joy, all sympathy, eternally. This was truly the decisive incident of my life. I had been split through the forehead between the eyebrows, a wound that was to throb with pain whenever I came in contact with a human being. I sympathize, but I hope it's taught you a lesson. I won't be coming back. This place is a perfect hell. But you should forgive Yoshiko. After all, you're not much of a prize yourself. So long. Hariki was not stupid enough to linger in an embarrassing situation. I got up and poured myself a glass of gin. I wept bitterly, crying aloud. I could have wept on, interminably. Without my realizing it, Yoshiko was standing haplessly behind me bearing a platter with a mountain of beans on it. He told me he wouldn't do anything. It's all right. Don't say anything. You didn't know enough to distrust others. Sit down. Let's eat the beans. We sat down side by side and ate the beans. Is trustfulness a sin, I wonder? The man was an illiterate shopkeeper, an undersized friend of about 30, who used to ask me to draw cartoons for him, and then LD make a great ado over the trifling sums of money he paid for them. The shopkeeper, not surprisingly, did not come again. I felt less hatred for him than I did for Hariki. Why, when he first discovered them together, had he not cleared his throat then, instead of returning to the roof to inform me? On nights when I could not sleep, hatred and loathing for him gathered inside me, until I groaned under the pressure. I neither forgave nor refused to forgive her. Yoshiko was a genius at trusting people. She didn't know how to suspect anyone. But the misery it caused. God, I ask you, is trustfulness a sin? It was less the fact of Yoshiko's defilement than the defilement of her trust in people which became so persistent a source of grief as almost to render my life insupportable. For someone like myself in whom the ability to trust others is so cracked and broken that I am wretchedly timid and am forever trying to read the expression on people's faces, Yoshiko's immaculate trustfulness seemed clean and pure, like a waterfall among green leaves. One night sufficed to turn the waters of this pure cascade yellow and muddy. Yoshiko began from that night to fret over my every smile or frown. She would jump when I called her, and seemed at a loss which way to turn. She remained tense and Afraid, no matter how much I tried to make her smile, no matter how much I played the clown. She began to address me with an excessive profusion of honorifics. Is immaculate trustfulness, after all, a source of sin? I looked up various novels in which married women are violated. I tried reading them, but I could not find a single instance of a woman violated in so lamentable a manner as Yoshiko. Her story, obviously, could never be made into a novel. I might actually have felt better if anything in the least resembling love existed between that runt of a shopkeeper and Yoshiko, but one summer night Yoshiko was trusting. And that was all there was to it. And on account of that incident I was cleft between the eyebrows, my voice became hoarse, my hair turned prematurely gray, and Yoshiko was condemned to a life of anxiety. In most of the novels I read, emphasis was placed on whether or not the husband forgave the wife's act. It seemed to me, however, that any husband who still retains the right to forgive or not to forgive is a lucky man. If he thinks that he can't possibly forgive his wife, he ought, instead of making such a great fuss, to get divorced as quickly as possible and find a new wife. If he can't do that, he should forgive and show forbearance. In either case, the matter can be completely settled in whichever way the husband's feelings dictate. In other words, even though such an incident certainly comes as a great shock to the husband, it is a shock and not an endless scries of waves, which lash back at him over and over again. It seemed to me a problem which could be disposed of by the wrath of any husband with authority. But in our case the husband was without authority, and when I thought things over, I came to feel that everything was my fault. Far from becoming enraged, I could not utter a word of complaint. It was on account of that rare virtue she possessed that my wife was violated, a virtue I long had prized, the unbearably pitiful one called immaculate trustfulness. Is immaculate trustfulness a sin? Now that I harbored doubts about the one virtue I had depended on, I lost all comprehension of everything around me. My only resort was drink. My face coarsened markedly and my teeth fell out from the interminable drinking bouts to which I surrendered myself. The cartoons I drew now verged on the pornographic. No, I'll come out with it plainly. I began about this time to copy pornographic pictures which I secretly peddled. I wanted money to buy gin. When I looked at Yoshiko, always averting her glance and trembling, doubt gave birth to fresh doubt. It was unlikely, wasn't it, that a woman with absolutely no defenses should have yielded only that once with the shopkeeper. Had she been also with Hariki? Or with somebody I didn't even know? I hadn't the courage to question her. Writhing in my usual doubts and fears, I drank gin. Sometimes, when drunk, I timidly attempted a few sneaking ventures at indirect questioning. In my heart, I bounded foolishly from joy to sorrow at her responses, but on the surface, I never ceased my immoderate clowning. Afterwards, I would inflict on Yoshiko an abominable, hellish caressing before I dropped into a dead sleep. Towards the end of that year, I came home late one night, blind drunk. I felt like having a glass of sugar water. Yoshiko seemed to be asleep, so I went myself to the kitchen to look for the sugar bowl. I took off the lid and peered inside. There was no sugar, only a thin black cardboard box. I took it absent-mindedly in my hand and read the label. I was startled. Somebody had scratched off most of the writing, but the part in Western letters remained intact. The word dial was legible. Dial. At the time I relied entirely on gin and never took sleeping pills. Insomnia, however, was a chronic complaint with me, and I was familiar with most sleeping pills. The contents of this one box of dial was unquestionably more than sufficient to cause death. The seal of the box was unbroken. I must have hidden it here at some time or other in the past when I felt I might need it, after first scratching off the label. The poor child could not read Western letters, and I must have thought it was enough if I just scratched off with my nails the part of the label in Japanese. You have committed no sin. I very quietly filled a glass with water, careful not to make the least noise, and deliberately broke the seal of the box. I poured the whole contents into my mouth. I calmly drained the glass of water in one gulp. I switched off the light and went to bed at once. For 3 days and nights I lay as one dead. The doctor considered it an accident, and was kind enough to postpone reporting to the police. I am told that the first words I murmured as I began to recover consciousness were, "I'm going home." It's not clear, even to myself, what place I meant by home, but in any case these were the words I said, accompanied, I was told, by profuse weeping. Gradually the fog cleared, and when I regained consciousness there was Flatfish sitting at my pillow, a most unpleasant expression on his face. The last time was also at the end of Tilai year, wasn't it? He always chooses the end of the year, just when everybody is frantically busy. He'll prove the death of me if he keeps on doing such things. The madam of the bar in Kyobashi was the recipient of Flatfish's discourse. I called, "Madam." "What? Have you come too?" She held her smiling face directly over mine as she spoke. I burst into tears. "Take me away from Yoshiko." The words came as a surprise even to myself. The madam rose to her feet and breathed a barely audible sigh. Then I made an utterly unpremeditated slip of the tongue, one so comic, so idiotic that it all but defies description. I said, "I'm going somewhere where there aren't any women." Flatfish was the first to respond, with loud guffaws. The madam tittered, and in the midst of my tears I turned red and smiled despite myself. "An excellent idea," said Flatfish, still continuing his inane laughter. "You really ought to go to a place with no women. Everything goes wrong as soon as women are around you." Yes, a place without women is a fine suggestion. A place without women. And the worst of it was that my delirious ravings were later to be realized in a most ghastly way. Yoshiko seemed to have got the idea that I had swallowed the overdose of sleeping pills by way of atonement for her sin, and this made her all the more uncertain before me. She never smiled, and she looked as if she could hardly be persuaded to open her mouth. I found the apartment so oppressive that I would end by going out as usual to swill cheap liquor. After the dial incident, however, I lost weight noticeably. My arms and legs felt heavy, and I often was too lazy to draw cartoons. Flatfish had left some money when he came to visit me. He said, "It's a little gift from me," and offered it exactly as if it were his own money, though I gathered that it actually came from my brothers as usual. This time, unlike when I ran away from Flatfish's house, I was able to get a vague glimpse through his theatrical airs of importance. I too was clever and, pretending to be completely unaware of what was going on, humbly offered Flatfish my thanks for the money. It nevertheless gave me a strange feeling, as if at the same time I could and could not understand why people like Flatfish resorted to such complicated tricks. I did not hesitate to use the money to go by myself to the hot springs of southern Aizu. However, I am not the kind to make a leisurely tour of hot springs, and at the thought of Yoshiko I became so infinitely forlorn as to destroy completely the peaceful frame of mind which would have permitted me to gaze from my hotel window at the mountains. I did not change into sports clothes. I didn't even take the waters. Instead, I would rush out into the filthy little bars that looked like souvenir stands, and drink gin until I fairly swam in it. I returned to Tokyo only sicklier for the trip. The night I returned to Tokyo, the snow was falling heavily. I drunkenly wandered along the rows of saloons behind the Ginza, singing to myself over and over again, so softly it was only a whisper, "From here it's hundreds of miles to home. From here it's hundreds of miles to home." I walked along kicking with the point of my shoes the snow which was accumulating. Suddenly I vomited. This was the first time I had brought up blood. It formed a big rising sun flag in the snow. I squatted there for a while. Then with both hands I scooped up snow from places which were still clean, and washed my face. I wept. "Where does this little path go? Where does this little path go?" I could hear indistinctly from the distance, like an auditory hallucination, the voice of a little girl singing. Unhappiness. There are all kinds of unhappy people in this world. I suppose it would be no exaggeration to say that the world is composed entirely of unhappy people. But those people can fight their unhappiness with society fairly and squarely, and society for its part easily understands and sympathizes with such struggles. My unhappiness stemmed entirely from my own vices, and I had no way of fighting anybody. If I had ever attempted to voice anything in the nature of a protest, even a single mumbled word, the whole of society, and not only Flatfish, would undoubtedly have cried out flabbergasted. Imagine the audacity of him talking like that! Am I what they call an egoist? Or am I the opposite, a man of excessively weak spirit? I really don't know myself, but since I seem in either case to be a mass of vices, I drop steadily, inevitably, into unhappiness, and I have no specific plan to stave off my descent. I got up from the snowbank with the thought, I ought to get the proper kind of medicine without delay. I went into a pharmacy nearby. The proprietress and I exchanged looks as I entered. For that instant her eyes popped, and she held her head lifted, as if caught in the light of a flash bulb. She stood ramrod stiff. But in her wide-open eyes there was no trace of alarm or dislike. Her look spoke of longing, almost of the seeking for salvation. I thought, she must be unhappy too. Unhappy people are sensitive to the unhappiness of others. Not until then did I happen to notice that she stood with difficulty, supporting herself on crutches. I suppressed a desire to run up beside her, but I could not take my eyes from her face. I felt tears starting, and saw then the tears brimming from her big eyes. That was all. Without saying a word I went out of the pharmacy, and staggered back to my apartment. I asked Yoshiko to prepare a bait solution. I drank it. I went to sleep without telling her anything. The whole of the following day I spent in bed, giving as excuse a lie to the effect that I felt a cold coming on. At night my agitation over the blood I had secretly coughed became too much for me, and I got out of bed. I went to the pharmacy again. This time I confessed with a smile to the woman what my physical condition was. In humble tones I asked her advice. You'll have to give up drinking. We were like blood relatives. I may have alcoholic poisoning. I still want to drink. You must. My husband used to soak himself in liquor in spite of his TB. He claimed that he killed the germs with liquor. That's how he shortened his life. I feel so on edge I can't stand it. I'm afraid. I'm no good for anything. I'll give you some medicine. But please cut out the drinking at least. She was a widow with an only son. The boy had been attending a medical school somewhere in the provinces, but was now on leave of absence from school with the same illness that killed his father. Her father-in-law lay abed in the house with palsy. She herself had been unable to move one side of her body since she was 5, when she had infantile paralysis. Hobbling here and there in the shop on her crutches, she selected various medicines from the different shelves and explained what they were. This is a medicine to build your blood. This is a serum for vitamin injections. Here is the hypodermic needle. These are calcium pills. This is diastase to keep you from getting an upset stomach. Her voice was full of tenderness as she explained each of the half-dozen medicines. The affection of this unhappy woman was, however, to prove too intense. At the last she said, "This is a medicine to be used when you need a drink so badly you can't stand it." She quickly wrapped the little box. It was morphine. She said that it was no more harmful than liquor, and I believed her. For one thing, I was just at the stage where I had come to feel the squalor of drunkenness, and I was overjoyed to be able to escape after such long bondage to the devil called alcohol. Without a flicker of hesitation I injected the morphine into my arm. My insecurity, fretfulness, and timidity were swept away completely. I turned into an expansively optimistic and fluent talker. The injections made me forget how weak my body was, and I applied myself energetically to my cartoons. Sometimes I would burst out laughing even while I was drawing. I had intended to take 1 shot a day, but it became 2, then 3. When it reached 4 I could no longer work unless I had my shots. All I needed was the woman at the pharmacy to admonish me, saying how dreadful it would be if I became an addict, for me to feel that I had already become a fairly confirmed addict. I am very susceptible to other people's suggestions. When people say to me, "You really shouldn't spend this money, but I suppose you will anyway," I have the strange illusion that I would be going against expectations and somehow doing wrong unless I spent it. I invariably spend all the money immediately. My uneasiness over having become an addict actually made me seek more of the drug. "I beg you, one more box. I promise I'll pay you at the end of the month. You can pay the bill any old time as far as I'm concerned, but the police are very troublesome, you know." Something impure, dark, reeking of the shady character always hovers about me. "I beg you, tell them something or other, put them off the track. They'll give you a kiss." She blushed. I pursued the theme. "I can't do any work unless I have the medicine. It's a kind of energy builder for me." "How about hormone injections?" "Don't be silly. It's liquor or that medicine, one or the other. If I haven't got it, I can't work." "You mustn't drink." "That's right. I haven't touched a drop of liquor since I began with that medicine. I'm in fine physical shape, thanks to you. I don't intend to go on drawing stupid cartoons forever, you know. Now that I've stopped drinking and have straightened myself out, I'm going to study. I'm sure I can become a great painter. I'll show you. If only I can get over this critical period. So please, how about a kiss?" She burst out laughing. "What a nuisance you are. You may already have become an addict for all I know." Her crutches clacked as she hobbled over to the shelf to take down some medicine. "I can't give you a whole box. You'd use it all up. Here's half." "How stingy you've become." "Well, if that's the best you can do." I gave myself a shot as soon as I got back home. Yoshiko timidly asked, "Doesn't it hurt?" "Of course it hurts. But I've got to do it, no matter how painful it is. That's the only way to increase the efficiency of my work. You've noticed how healthy I've been of late." Then, playfully, "Well, to work. To work, to work." Once, late at night, I knocked on the door of the pharmacy. As soon as I caught sight of the woman in her nightgown hobbling forward on her crutches, I threw my arms around her and kissed her. I pretended to weep. She handed me a box without a word. By the time I had come to realize acutely that drugs were as abominable, as foul, no, fouler than gin, I had already become an out-and-out addict. I had truly reached the extreme of shamelessness. Out of the desire to obtain the drug, I began again to make copies of pornographic pictures. I also had what might literally be called a very ugly affair with the crippled woman from the pharmacy. I thought, I want to die. I want to die more than ever before. There's no chance now of a recovery. No matter what sort of thing I do, no matter what I do, it's sure to be a failure, just a final coating applied to my shame. That dream of going on bicycles to see a waterfall framed in summer leaves, it was not for the likes of me. All that can happen now is that one foul, humiliating sin will be piled on another, and my sufferings will become only the more acute. I want to die. I must die. Living itself is the source of sin. I paced back and forth, half in a frenzy, between my apartment and the pharmacy. The more I worked, the more morphine I consumed, and my debt at the pharmacy reached a frightening figure. Whenever the woman caught sight of my face, the tears came to her eyes. I also wept. Inferno. I decided as a last resort, my last hope of escaping the inferno, to write a long letter to my father, which I confessed my circumstances fully and accurately, with the exception, of course, of my relations with women. If it failed, I had no choice but to hang myself, a resolve which was tantamount to a bet on the existence of God. The result was to make everything only the worse. The answer, for which I waited day and night, never came, and my anxiety and dread caused me to increase still further the dosage of the drug. I made up my mind one day to give myself 10 shots that night and throw myself into the river. But on the afternoon of the very day I chose for the event, Flatfish appeared with Hariki in tow, seemingly having managed with his diabolical intuition to sniff out my plan. Hariki sat in front of me and said, with a gentle smile, the like of which I had never before seen on his face, "I hear you've coughed blood." I felt so grateful, so happy for that gentle smile that I averted my face and wept. I was completely shattered and smothered by that one gentle smile. I was bundled into an automobile. Flatfish informed me in a quiet tone, so calm indeed that it might almost have been characterized as compassionate, that I should have to go for the time being to a hospital, and that I should leave everything to them. Weeping helplessly, I obeyed whatever the two of them decreed, like a man bereft of all will, decision and everything else. The four of us, Yoshiko came along, were tossed in the car for quite a long time. About dusk we pulled up at the entrance to a large hospital in the woods. My only thought was, this must be a sanatorium. I was given a careful, almost unpleasantly considerate examination by a young doctor. "You'll need to rest and recuperate here for a while," he said, pronouncing the words with a smile I could only describe as bashful. When Flatfish, Hariki and Yoshiko were about to go, leaving me there alone, Yoshiko handed me a bundle containing a change of clothes, then silently offered from her handbag the hypodermic needle and the remaining medicine. Is it possible she actually believed after all that it was just an energy-building medicine? "No," I said. "I won't need it anymore." This was a really rare event. I don't think it is an exaggeration to say that it was the one and only time in my life that I refused something offered to me. My unhappiness was the unhappiness of a person who could not say no. I had been intimidated by the fear that if I declined something offered me, a yawning crevice would open between the other person's heart and myself which could never be mended through all eternity. Yet I now refused in a perfectly natural manner the morphine which I had so desperately craved. Was it because I was struck by Yoshiko's divine ignorance? I wonder if I had not already ceased at that instant to be an addict. The young doctor with the bashful smile immediately ushered me to a ward. The key grated in the lock behind me. I was in a mental hospital. My delirious cry after I swallowed the sleeping pills, that I would go where there were no women, had now materialized in a truly uncanny way. My ward held only male lunatics, and the nurses also were men. There was not a single woman. I was no longer a criminal, I was a lunatic. But no, I was definitely not mad. I have never been mad for even an instant. They say, I know, that most lunatics claim the same thing. What it amounts to is that people who get put into this asylum are crazy, and those who don't are normal. God, I ask you, is non-resistance a sin? I had wept at that incredibly beautiful smile Hariki showed me, and forgetting both prudence and resistance, I had got into the car that took me here. And now I had become a madman. Even if released, I would be forever branded on the forehead with the word madman, or perhaps reject. I disqualified as a human being. I had now ceased utterly to be a human being. I came at the beginning of summer. Through the iron bars over the windows I could see water lilies blossoming in the little pond of the hospital. 3 months later, when the cosmos were beginning to bloom in the garden, my eldest brother and Flatfish came, to my great surprise, to take me out. My brother informed me in his habitually serious, strained voice that my father had died of gastric ulcers at the end of the previous month. We won't ask any questions about your past, and we'll see to it that you have no worries as far as your living expenses are concerned. You won't have to do anything. The only thing we ask is that you leave Tokyo immediately. I know you undoubtedly have all kinds of attachment here, but we want you to begin your convalescence afresh in the country. He added that I need not worry about my various commitments in Tokyo. Flatfish would take care of them. I felt as though I could see before my eyes the mountains and rivers backborne. I nodded faintly. A reject, exactly. The news of my father's death eviscerated me. He was dead, that familiar, frightening presence who had never left my heart for a split second. I felt as though the vessel of my suffering had become empty, as if nothing could interest me now. I had lost even the ability to suffer. My brother scrupulously carried out his promise. He bought a house for me at a hot spring on the coast, about 4 or 5 hours' journey by rail south of the town where I grew up, an unusually warm spot for that part of Japan. The house, a thatch-covered rather ancient-looking structure, stood on the outskirts of the village. It had 5 rooms. The walls were peeled and the woodwork was so worm-eaten as to seem almost beyond all possibility of repair. My brother also sent to look after me an ugly woman close to 60 with horrible rusty hair. Some 3 years have gone by since then. During this interval I have several times been violated in a curious manner by the old servant. Once in a while we quarrel like husband and wife. My chest ailment is sometimes better, sometimes worse. My weight fluctuates accordingly. Occasionally I cough blood. Yesterday I sent Tetsu, the old servant, off to the village drugstore to buy some sleeping pills. She came back with a box rather different in shape from the one I'm accustomed to, but I paid it no particular attention. I took 10 pills before I went to bed but was surprised not to be able to sleep at all. Presently I was seized with a cramp in my stomach. I rushed to the toilet 3 times in succession with terrible diarrhea. My suspicions were aroused. I examined the box of medicine carefully. It was a laxative. As I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling, a hot water bottle on my stomach, I wondered whether I ought to complain to Tetsu. I thought of saying, "These aren't sleeping pills. They're a laxative," but I burst out laughing. I think reject must be a comic noun. I had taken a laxative in order to go to sleep. Now I have neither happiness nor unhappiness. Everything passes. That is the one and only thing I have thought resemble the truth in the society of human beings where I have dwelled up to now as in a burning hell. Everything passes. This year I am 27. My hair has become much grayer. Most people would take me for over 40. Epilogue. I never personally met the madman who wrote these notebooks. However, I have a bare acquaintance with the woman who, as far as I can judge, figures in these notebooks as the madam of a bar in Kaibahi. She is a slightly built, rather sickly-looking woman, with narrow, tilted eyes and a prominent nose. Something hard about her gives you the impression less of a beautiful woman than of a handsome young man. The events described in the notebook seem to relate mainly to the Tokyo of 1930 or so, but it was not until about 1935, when the Japanese military clique was first beginning to rampage in the open, that friends took me to the bar. I drank highballs there 2 or 3 times. I was never able therefore to have the pleasure of meeting the man who wrote the notebooks. However, this February I visited a friend who was evacuated during the war to Funabashi in Chiba Prefecture. He is an acquaintance from university days, and now teaches at a women's college. My purpose in visiting him was to ask his help in arranging the marriage of one of my relatives, but I thought while I was at it, I might buy some fresh tea food to take home to the family. I set off for Funabashi with a rucksack on my back. Funabashi is a fairly large town facing a muddy bay. My friend had not lived there long, and even though I asked for his house by the street and number, nobody seemed able to tell me the way. It was cold, and the rucksack hurt my shoulders. Attracted by the sound of a record of violin music being played inside a coffee shop, I pushed open the door. I vaguely remembered having seen the madam. I asked her about herself, and discovered she was in fact the madam of the bar in Kyobashi I had visited 10 years before. When this was established, she professed to remember me also. We expressed exaggerated surprise and laughed a great deal. There were many things to discuss even without resorting, as people always did in those days, to questions about each other's experiences during the air raids. I said, "You haven't changed a bit." "No, I'm an old woman already. I creak at the joints." "You're the one who really looks young." "Don't be silly. I've got 3 children now. I've come today to buy them some seafood." We exchanged these and other greetings appropriate to long-separated friends and asked for news of mutual acquaintances. The madam suddenly broke off to ask, in a rather different tone, if by chance I had ever known Yozo. I answered that I never had, whereupon she went inside and brought out 3 notebooks and 3 photographs which she handed to me. She said, "Maybe they'll make good material for a novel." I can never write anything when people force material on me, and I was about to return the lot to her without even examining it. The photographs, however, fascinated me, and I decided after all to accept the notebooks. I promised to stop by again on the way back, and asked her if she happened to know where my friend lived. As a fellow newcomer, she knew him. Sometimes, in fact, he even patronized her shop. His house was just a few steps away. That night, after drinking for a while with my friend, I decided to spend the night. I became so immersed in reading the notebooks that I didn't sleep a wink till morning. The events described took place years ago, but I felt sure that people today would still be quite interested in them. I thought that it would make more sense if I asked some magazine to publish the whole thing as it was, rather than attempt any clumsy improvements. The only souvenirs of the town I could get for my children were some dried fish. I left my friend's house with my rucksack still half empty, and stopped by the coffee shop. I came to the point at once. "I wonder if I could borrow these notebooks for a while." "Yes, of course." "Is the man who wrote them still alive?" "I haven't any idea. About 10 years ago somebody sent me a parcel containing the notebooks and the photographs to my place in Kyobashi. I'm sure it was Yozo who sent it, but he didn't write his address or even his name on the parcel. It got mixed up with other things during the air raids, but miraculously enough the notebooks were saved. Just the other day I read through them for the first time." "Did you cry?" "No. I didn't cry. I just kept thinking that when human beings get that way, they're no good for anything. It's been 10 years. I suppose he may be dead already. He must have sent the notebooks to you by way of thanks. Some parts are rather exaggerated, I can tell, but you obviously suffered a hell of a lot at his hands. If everything written in these notebooks is true, I probably would have wanted to put him in an insane asylum myself if I were his friend. It's his father's fault," she said unemotionally. "The Yozo we knew was so easygoing and amusing, and if only he hadn't drink. No, even though he did drink, he was a good boy, an angel.